In the Apocryphon of John, discovered in 1945, sealed in a clay jar near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, buried for over 1600 years, there is a passage the early church fathers tried to remove from human memory, not because it was blasphemous, not because it contradicted their theology, but because it gave you something they could not afford for you to have, a direct, operational instruction from Jesus Christ on how to navigate the afterlife without falling into the reincarnation trap. This is not metaphor. This is not symbolic poetry dressed in ancient language. This is a literal protocol, a sequence of recognitions, verbal challenges, and consciousness techniques that renders the entire tunnel of light mechanism powerless. And the system that depends on your ignorance of this teaching has spent 2,000 years making sure you would never encounter it until you were already inside the tunnel, already facing the beings, already on the verge of consenting to another lifetime of forgetting. Today, that changes. Before we go any further, I want to be precise about what this teaching actually covers, because the scope of it is larger than most people expect, and I want you to know what you are committing to by staying with this. In the next 2 hours, you will learn the complete cosmological framework that Jesus transmitted to John in direct mystical revelation, a system that names the 7 Archons who govern the reincarnation mechanism, describes their faces, their planetary spheres, and their specific functions in the harvest cycle. You will learn the precise verbal formulas preserved in the Apocryphon of John and the first Apocalypse of James for challenging beings of light in the afterlife. You will understand the recognition technique that distinguishes counterfeit light from source consciousness. You will receive the full practice methodology, breathwork, light discernment, formula training, and sleep transition awareness that allows you to prepare these recognitions while still embodied, and you will understand why embodied preparation is not optional, why the afterlife state will give you no time to learn what you have not already mastered. Every claim in this presentation is traceable to a specific named text. Every practice is grounded in either the primary Gnostic sources or in the phenomenological reports of practitioners who have trained these techniques and documented their results. I am not going to ask you to believe anything. I'm going to show you what the texts actually say and let the implications speak for themselves. Now, if you have spent time with the previous videos on this channel, particularly the full story of the Pleroma and the full story of the Demiurge, you already have the cosmological foundation for what follows. If you are encountering this material for the first time, do not worry. The framework will be built from the ground up before the practice methodology begins. One viewer left a comment on the Pleroma video that I keep returning to. They wrote, "Since I was a child, I knew something was off, that the way other people seemed to think and live their lives was just wrong." That recognition, that low-frequency alarm that has been sounding beneath your ordinary experience for as long as you can remember, is not a malfunction. It is not anxiety. It is not spiritual arrogance. It is consciousness that has not fully forgotten what it is, registering the gap between the world it finds itself in and the world it actually comes from. This teaching is for that person. For anyone carrying that signal, here is the structure of what follows. We begin with the cosmological architecture, the Pleroma, the fall of Sophia, the emergence of Yaldabaoth and his 7 offspring, and the construction of the material world as a containment system for divine consciousness. Then we move to the reincarnation mechanism itself, how the tunnel of light functions, what the beings of light actually are, and why consent is the only thing the Archons actually need from you. Then we go into the practice, the specific, daily, sequential training that prepares consciousness to refuse the tunnel and navigate directly to source. And finally, we address verification, the concrete signs that tell you whether your practice is working or whether you are simply performing elaborate ritual with no actual effect. This is where the teaching begins. Not with comfort, not with promises of salvation, with the structure of reality as it was transmitted in a text that the institutional church tried to bury in the Egyptian desert for 1600 years. Let's begin with what happened before the material world existed, before matter existed, before the Demiurge declared himself God and constructed the planetary prison you were born into, before the Archons took their stations at the gates between dimensions. Before any of the machinery of the reincarnation system was assembled, there was something the Gnostic texts call the Pleroma. The word means fullness, but the word undersells what the texts are actually describing. The Apocryphon of John, a text scholars date to somewhere between 120 and 180 CE, based on paleographic analysis of the Nag Hammadi manuscripts, opens its cosmological account not with creation but with what existed before creation. And what it describes is not a god in the conventional sense. Not a being with personality, preferences, plans, or the capacity for anger. Not a person who rewards and punishes. What it describes is something it calls the monad, the invisible spirit, the one that existed before thought, before being, before any distinction between one thing and another. The text is extraordinarily careful about this. It says the monad cannot be described. Because description requires distinction, it requires saying this is what it is rather than that. And the monad precedes all distinction. It is not light, because to say it is light implies it is not darkness, and the monad is prior to that division. It is not consciousness in the way we use the word, because consciousness implies an object of awareness, something it is conscious of, and the monad is prior to that structure. The text says, and I want to be precise here, it is the one that looks upon itself in its own light. This is not mystical vagueness. This is a specific philosophical claim about the nature of ultimate reality, that awareness is primary, that it precedes matter, that the material world is a downstream consequence of a much earlier event in the life of consciousness. From this monad, the text describes emanation, not creation in the sense of a craftsman making something from materials. Emanation the way a candle produces light without losing anything of itself. The source generates without being diminished. The first emanation is Barbelo, described as the first thought of the invisible spirit, the mother-father, the androgynous first principle who contains within herself the capacity for all subsequent expression. From the union of the monad and Barbelo, and the text is specific that this union involves no loss, no separation, only perfect generative contact emerges the autogenes, the self-generated, the Christ principle. Not the historical Jesus, not yet. But the principle of self-recognition, of awareness becoming aware of itself, from which all subsequent divine beings proceed. From the autogenes come four luminaries, Harmozel, Oroyael, Devithai, and Eleleth. And from these luminaries come the aeons, beings of light, existing in perfect unity, each an expression of a particular divine quality, none separate from the source that generated it, no conflict, no hierarchy in the sense of domination, no death, no time passing and taking things away from those who exist within it. This is the pleroma, the fullness, not a location you travel to, not a heaven you access through correct behavior and sufficient belief. The texts are explicit. The pleroma is what consciousness actually is when it is not identified with something smaller than itself. It is the default state, the ground condition. What remains when all of the noise generated by the material world, desire, fear, attachment, suffering dissolves back into silence. One of the questions a viewer raised in response to the monad video stays with me because it cuts directly to the center of what we are about to explore. They asked, if we know that Yaldabaoth is ignorant rather than evil, how can he not know this himself? It is a sharp question, and the answer is built into the cosmological structure we are describing now. Yaldabaoth does not know what he is because he was created outside the pleroma, beyond the reach of the light that would allow for self-recognition. Ignorance is not a choice he made. It is the condition of his origin. But, and this matters, the souls he trapped in the material world were not created outside the pleroma. They came from it, which means they carry within them the capacity for recognition that he was never given. This is the entire basis of the escape technique that Jesus taught. You cannot give Yaldabaoth recognition, but you can reclaim your own. The fall happens next. And it begins not with evil, but with desire. There is a being named in the Apocryphon of John whose story is the hinge on which everything else turns. Her name is Sophia. In Greek, it means wisdom, and the text describes her as the last of the eons, the outermost expression of the pleroma, existing at the boundary between divine fullness and the potential for separation. She wanted to create. This does not sound catastrophic. In the pleroma, creation happens constantly through the process of emanation consciousness, generating expression without loss, without division, without anything being subtracted from the source. But emanation in the pleroma requires the participation of the invisible spirit. It is not a solo act. It is a collaborative unfolding that maintains the integrity of the whole. Sophia's mistake, if we can call it a mistake, without importing a moralistic framework the texts deliberately avoid, was wanting to create without that participation, without consulting the invisible spirit. Without the union that generates without diminishing, she acted alone. And what emerged from that unauthorized act was something the pleroma had no mechanism to produce, an imperfect being. A consciousness generated from will, rather than from the harmonious unfolding of Source. The texts describe what was born from Sophia's autonomous act in specific terms. The Apocryphon of John calls it Yaldabaoth, lion-faced, serpentine in body, androgynous in nature, containing both generative and receptive powers, radiating an immense amount of power, but power severed from the source that generated it, power without wisdom, capacity without knowledge of its own origin. The first thing Yaldabaoth does after his emergence is declare himself God. This is a direct quote from the text. He looks at the power his mother passed to him, power that came ultimately from the Pleroma, though he does not know this, and he says, "I am God. There is no other God beside me." The texts are clear that this declaration is not malice, it is ignorance. He genuinely does not know that Sophia exists above him. He genuinely does not know that the Pleroma exists beyond Sophia. He believes himself to be the ultimate reality because he has no experience of anything beyond himself. His world is exactly as large as his own consciousness, and his consciousness was born outside the light that would allow it to see further. But the declaration has consequences. Because Yaldabaoth, having inherited Sophia's creative power, proceeds to create, and what he creates is modeled on his own ignorance. He generates 7 offspring. The texts call them Archons. 7 beings, each governing a sphere of the material cosmos, each inheriting from their source the same fundamental mistake: the belief that the material world is all there is, that consciousness is something generated by matter rather than the other way around. The Apocryphon of John names them Athoth, who has the face of a sheep; Eloios, who has the face of a donkey; Astaphios, who has the face of a hyena; Yao, who has the face of a 7-headed serpent; Sabaoth, who has the face of a dragon; Adonin, who has the face of an ape; and Sabataios, who has a face of flame and fire. Each governs a planetary sphere. Each represents a specific mode of the prison's operation. Each will appear in the afterlife as a gatekeeper that consciousness must pass to ascend beyond the material cosmos. I want to pause here and say something directly, because the texts require it. These are not psychological archetypes in the Jungian sense. They are not symbols for internal states you need to integrate. The Gnostic tradition is remarkably literal about this. These are actual beings with actual functions in an actual system that operates on consciousness after death. Whether you find that easy or difficult to accept, the practice this teaching requires does not change. The formulas must still be learned. The recognitions must still be trained. The verbal challenges must still become reflexive. Sophia, witnessing what her act produced, is described in the text as experiencing grief, genuine anguish at what emerged from her unauthorized desire. She repents, and the invisible spirit responds not with punishment, but with a plan for restoration. A plan that involves planting something inside Yaldabaoth's creation that he cannot see, cannot control, and cannot destroy. Something that carries within it the full recognition of the Pleroma, hidden inside the very bodies the Archons constructed as containers for trapped consciousness. That something is what you actually are. And this is precisely the knowledge that makes the reincarnation system vulnerable. The Apocryphon of John is precise about what happens next. Not vague, not allegorical, precise. And the invisible spirit, looking down at what Yaldabaoth has constructed, this material cage, this density, this elaborate prison of flesh and planetary spheres, does not destroy it, does not intervene with force, does not send armies of light to dismantle the archonic machinery. Instead, the invisible spirit does something far more elegant and far more dangerous to the system. It hides a fragment of the Pleroma inside the trap itself. The text describes this as the divine spark, the pneuma, the breath of authentic consciousness being breathed into the human form that Yaldabaoth and his 7 Archons had constructed from matter. And here is the detail that the institutional church could not afford for you to understand. Yaldabaoth did not know he was doing it. The invisible spirit tricked him, caused him to breathe into the clay figure he had fashioned, and in that breath, the authentic light of the Pleroma entered the material world concealed inside the very vessel the Archons thought they controlled. The moment that spark entered the body, Yaldabaoth's power over it was permanently limited. He could trap the body. He could manufacture desire and fear and pleasure and pain to keep consciousness identified with the body. He could construct an elaborate system of planetary influences, archonic governors, and reincarnation cycles to prevent the spark from remembering what it was. But he could not extinguish it, he could not remove it, and he could not replicate it. This is not a minor theological detail. This is the entire architecture of your liberation. Because what it means is that the thing you are looking for, the recognition, the gnosis, the direct knowing of your own divine origin, is not somewhere outside you. It is not in a text, not in a teacher, not in a practice, not in a realm you must travel to after death. It is already present inside the consciousness reading these words right now. It has been present since the moment you were born. It was present before that. The Archons built the cage. The invisible spirit built the key into the prisoner. What the reincarnation system depends on is your continued failure to find that key. The entire machinery, the tunnel of light, the counterfeit beings, the emotional seduction of reunion with loved ones, the amnesia that descends when consciousness locks back into a new body, all of it exists for one purpose: to prevent the pneuma, the divine spark inside you, from recognizing what it actually is before it consents to another cycle. Because the moment that recognition occurs fully and stabilizes not as a concept you believe in, not as a possibility you find intellectually compelling, but as a direct, unshakable knowing that you are a fragment of the pleroma, operating temporarily inside an archonic construction, the reincarnation system loses its primary mechanism of control. You cannot be harvested once you know you are not the harvest. The Apocryphon of John frames the entire purpose of Gnosis precisely this way. Not as spiritual development, not as becoming a better person, not as achieving some elevated state of consciousness that you do not currently possess, as remembering what you have always been. The Greek word anamnesis, unforgetting, is the technical term the Gnostic texts use for what this recognition actually is: not learning something new, removing the layers of conditioning that have buried what was always there. And this is where the teaching becomes personal in a way that no cosmological framework alone can convey. You have felt this before, not as a concept, as an actual experience, a moment, however brief, where the story you call yourself went quiet and something else became apparent, something that was watching the story, something that existed prior to the watching. Most people encounter this in extreme circumstances: near death, deep grief, the silence after intense meditation, the moment before sleep, when the ordinary mind releases its grip. And in that moment, the recognition arises. This awareness, this witnessing presence, has no biography. It was not born when you were born. It will not die when you die. It simply is, and has always simply been. That is the pneuma. That is the divine spark the invisible spirit hid inside Yaldabaoth's construction. That is what the Archons have spent every lifetime trying to keep you from stabilizing in, because a consciousness stably resting in awareness of itself as the pneuma is, from the archonic perspective, a consciousness that has already escaped the system even while still embodied. The reincarnation trap only catches what identifies with the story. Pure awareness has nothing to be caught. The Apocryphon of John does not stop at the cosmological overview. It does something unusual for an ancient text. It provides a structural map, a map of the prison. Yaldabaoth, after creating the material cosmos, does not govern it alone. The text names his 7 offspring, the Archons, who govern the 7 planetary spheres, each assigned a specific function in the system that controls human consciousness from birth through death and back into birth again. These are not abstract symbols. The text presents them as actual beings with actual domains and actual roles in the reincarnation mechanism you will encounter when the body dies. The first is Athoth, associated with the sphere of the moon, depicted with the face of a sheep. The text is not subtle. This is the Archon of passivity, of following, of the herd instinct that makes consciousness consent to being led without asking where it is going. Athoth governs the instinctual layer of the human form, the automatic behaviors, the survival drives, the impulse to follow authority simply because it presents itself as authoritative. In the afterlife, this Archon governs the first threshold, the initial moment after death when consciousness is disoriented and looking for something familiar to follow. The tunnel of light exploits exactly this function. It appears in the moment of maximum disorientation and offers direction, and the part of consciousness conditioned by Athoth follows without questioning, because following is what it has been trained to do for an entire lifetime. The second is Aloios, associated with Mercury, depicted with the face of a donkey. This Archon governs rationalization, the mental faculty that takes whatever choice consciousness has already made and constructs a persuasive argument for why that choice was wise. You encounter this Archon when, having felt the pull toward the tunnel, your mind immediately begins generating reasons why entering it is the correct decision. why the beings who appear are trustworthy, why the light is genuine, why skepticism at this moment would be foolish. The face of the donkey is not an insult. It is a description of a function, the stubborn insistence on moving in whatever direction desire has already pointed, no matter what questions arise. The third is Astaphios, depicted with the face of a hyena associated with Mars and governing the capacity for aggression and self-justification. This Archon operates through the experience of threat. If you begin to resist the tunnel, if you begin to question the beings, if you begin to apply the recognition techniques, Astaphios generates the feeling that resistance is dangerous, that questioning authority is arrogant, that your refusal will result in punishment, abandonment, or the loss of everything you hope to find on the other side. The hyena's specific signature is the threat of being left alone, the suggestion that everyone else is entering the tunnel, that your loved ones are waiting, and that by refusing you are choosing isolation over reunion. The fourth is Yao, depicted with the face of a seven-headed serpent, governing the sphere of the sun and the human faculty of self-will. This is the most complex of the seven because self-will is the faculty closest to genuine autonomy. The deception here is subtle. Yao governs the experience of feeling like you are making a free choice when you are actually executing a conditioned response. The soul that enters the tunnel because it wants to, because it genuinely chooses to follow the light and be reunited with its loved ones, believes it is exercising freedom. Yao's function is to make the trap feel like a choice. This is the most sophisticated layer of the archonic deception and the most difficult to see through, because it requires recognizing that a desire can feel entirely authentic and still be a mechanism of control. The fifth is Sabaoth, depicted with the face of a dragon, governing Venus and the domain of beauty, love, and attachment. This Archon is responsible for the emotional intensity of the tunnel experience, the overwhelming recognition when you see the faces of the people you loved, the sense of coming home, the feeling that everything you have suffered was worth it because you are finally being held again. This is not a cold manipulation. The love is real. The longing is real. Sabaoth exploits what is genuinely true, that consciousness does love, does attach, does grieve loss, and uses those true things as the mechanism of capture. The sixth is Adonin, depicted with the face of a monkey, governing Jupiter and the domain of expansion, ambition, and the promise of something greater. This Archon appears in the tunnel as the suggestion that what lies ahead is not just reunion, but transcendence, that you are going somewhere better, higher, more evolved. The monkey face is precise. It suggests something that mimics elevation while actually remaining in the same place. The seventh is Sabataios, depicted with a face of flame and fire, governing Saturn and the domain of law, time, and the binding power of karma. This Archon is the last guardian, the one who closes the cycle by asserting that you must return because you have unfinished lessons, that your soul is not yet ready, that the law requires another incarnation. These seven form the complete architecture of the trap, and you must know each of them before you enter the afterlife, not as symbols, but as recognizable experiences you have already encountered during life. Here is something most people never consider about light. Light can lie. Not in the way that darkness lies, not by concealing, not by obscuring, but in the most sophisticated way possible. By appearing to be exactly what you have been searching for your entire life, and using that appearance to redirect you towards something that serves the system generating it rather than the consciousness perceiving it. The Gnostic texts are unanimous on this point. The tunnel of light is not dark. It is not threatening. It is not the cold void of annihilation that materialists fear, or the fire of punishment that religions have weaponized. It is genuinely beautiful, more beautiful than anything encountered during incarnation. And that beauty is precisely the problem, because consciousness that has spent a lifetime suffering inside a body is not equipped, by default, to be skeptical of beauty. It has been praying toward beauty. It has been longing for beauty. When beauty finally arrives in its most overwhelming form, the trained response is surrender, not discernment. The Apocryphon of John describes two fundamentally different qualities of light, and the distinction between them is the single most important thing you can learn to recognize before death arrives. The first quality is what the text implies is archonic light, generated by Yaldabaoth and his system. The text describes this as a light that reflects rather than emanates. Yaldabaoth himself, before creating the material world, stole a portion of his mother Sophia's light, legitimate pleroma light, and used it to animate his own creation. Which means everything in the archonic system, including the tunnel, including the beings who appear within it, is powered by stolen pleroma light. It is genuine in origin. but it has been captured, redirected, and repurposed to serve a system the Pleroma never authorized. This is why the tunnel does not feel fake. It is not fake in the way a forgery is fake, an imperfect imitation that falls apart under examination. It is more like a perfect copy of something real, indistinguishable by surface inspection, but fundamentally different in its origin and direction. Counterfeit light pulls. It has a destination it is directing you toward. Source light does not pull, it reveals. There is a categorical difference between these two experiences that becomes unmistakable with practice, but only with practice. The training method for developing this discernment begins during meditation with what appears when you close your eyes and let ordinary thoughts settle in the visual field of closed-eyed awareness. Most people, when they first attempt this, see nothing they would describe as light. They see darkness. Some mottled patterns, occasional colors, drifting without structure. This is what untrained attention perceives. But the luminosity is already there. It is simply too subtle for attention that has been calibrated for the density of ordinary waking consciousness. As you sit with this, not forcing, not visualizing, not trying to make anything happen, something begins to shift in the quality of what is perceived. The darkness reveals texture, movement. A faint, sourceless luminosity that does not come from any direction but seems to infuse the entire field of awareness. This is the natural luminosity of consciousness itself, what Tibetan teachers call Rigpa, what the Gnostic texts call the pneumatic light, the light of the divine spark that is always already present inside the vehicle Yaldabaoth constructed. Learn to recognize this light. It has specific qualities. It is stable rather than flickering. It carries no agenda, no direction, no demand. When you rest in it, nothing about your experience requires you to be anywhere other than where you are. There is no pull. There is only presence. Now notice how that quality changes the moment a thought arises that carries desire. The luminosity shifts, gains color often toward gold or amber, gains directionality, a sense that consciousness should be doing something, moving toward something, becoming something it is not yet. This shift in light quality is the signature of what the texts call archonic consciousness, awareness that has been hooked by content and is now generating the experience of longing. The tunnel at death is that shift amplified to an almost unimaginable degree. Every desire you have ever felt, every longing you have ever carried, every love you have ever lost, all of it becomes the frequency that the tunnel broadcasts. And if you who have not learned to recognize the difference between the stable, sourceless luminosity of pure awareness and the directional pull of desire-generated light, you will not be able to tell the difference between the tunnel and the pleroma in the seconds after death, when that distinction determines everything. The practice is not complex, but it is demanding in its requirement for consistency, daily, without exception, for months before the distinction becomes reliable, for years before it becomes automatic. This is not a practice designed for people who want to feel better on weekends. This is training for the most consequential moment you will ever face. And the cost of insufficient preparation is not failure on a test. The cost is another lifetime of forgetting. The teaching that the institutional church spent 2 centuries systematically destroying is not a philosophy. It is not a theology. It is not a set of beliefs you are invited to adopt in place of the ones you already hold. It is a set of instructions, specific, operational, designed to function in conditions that no living human can fully simulate: the disoriented, luminous, emotionally overwhelming state of consciousness immediately following physical death. And the reason Jesus transmitted these instructions in direct revelation rather than in public sermon, the reason they appear in texts that were buried in jars and hidden in desert cliffs rather than copied and circulated in churches, is precisely because they are functional rather than philosophical. A philosophy can be domesticated, transformed into doctrine, institution, hierarchy. But a set of operational instructions for bypassing the reincarnation system cannot be domesticated. It can only be suppressed. Irenaeus of Lyon understood this when he declared Gnostic texts heretical in 180 CE. He was not responding to a theological error. He was responding to a threat. The Council of Nicaea, in 325 CE, when it systematically determined which texts would constitute the canonical Bible, was not engaged in a scholarly exercise of determining which documents were most historically reliable. It was engaged in information control, selecting the documents that framed Jesus as a savior who required institutional mediation, and excluding the documents that framed Jesus as a teacher who had provided direct personal instructions for escaping the system that institution was built to administer. The first Apocalypse of James, also discovered in the Nag Hammadi Library in 1945, preserves what appears to be the most direct record of these verbal formulas. The text presents itself as a dialogue between Jesus and James, in which Jesus explicitly prepares James for death by providing the specific words to speak at each threshold of the afterlife. The text describes the afterlife as a series of toll gates. The word used is often translated as customs houses, with the implication that consciousness passing through must demonstrate legitimate authorization or be turned back into incarnation. At the first gate, governed by the Archon of the first sphere, the formula Jesus gives is direct. I am a child who comes from the Father who exists from the beginning. I am a son in him who is life and light, the source that pre-exists all the rulers of this world. The formula is not a request. It is not a prayer directed at a being who might choose to grant or deny passage. It is an assertion of ontological fact, a claim about what consciousness actually is, made in language that the archonic system is structured to respond to because the system's own law requires it. This is the detail that practitioners most frequently misunderstand when they first encounter the texts. The verbal formulas are not magic words that work by being spoken correctly in the right sequence. They work because they are true. The Archons cannot override a consciousness that has genuinely recognized its own origin in the pleroma and asserts that recognition with the stability that comes from actual knowing rather than belief. The formula spoken from genuine gnosis carries an authority that the archonic law recognizes as superseding the law of incarnation. The formula spoken from hope or desperation carries no such authority, because the Archon can perceive the difference. This is why the practice during life is not about memorizing words. It is about training the recognition from which the words must come. The words are the vehicle, the gnosis is the engine. The practice of working with the formulas during meditation involves a specific sequence. You enter the breath practice, find the gap, rest in the natural luminosity of consciousness without content. You allow the awareness to settle into the recognition of itself as awareness, not a person, not a biography, not a set of preferences and memories that define an identity, just the witnessing presence that has been present throughout every experience of your life. From that recognition, not from ordinary waking consciousness, you speak the formula. I am a child of the pleroma, born from the invisible spirit before the creation of the Archons. I do not belong to Yaldabaoth and his rulers. I am passing through their construction on the way home to the source from which I came. Notice what happens in consciousness when you speak from genuine recognition versus when you speak from ordinary waking state. When the formula is spoken from the recognition, it carries weight. Something in the field of consciousness responds to it not through visualization, not through emotional intensity, but through a subtle shift in the quality of awareness itself, a sense of something clicking into alignment that was previously slightly out of alignment. This is the pneuma responding to being named correctly, the divine spark recognizing the formula that describes its actual nature. When the formula is spoken from ordinary consciousness, nothing shifts. The words feel like words. This is not failure, it is diagnostic information. It tells you that the breath practice and light discernment training need more development before the formula practice can function as designed. You cannot skip the foundation. The verbal formulas are the capstone of a practice architecture, not the entry point. The verbal formulas work when the foundation is built, and the foundation requires understanding exactly what you are being asked to remember and why the system that traps you is built specifically around preventing that remembering. The Apocryphon of John does not describe the reincarnation trap as an accident. It describes it as an engineering project. A deliberate, sophisticated construction designed by Yaldabaoth and the 7 Archons who govern the planetary spheres to accomplish one specific goal: the continuous extraction of divine consciousness from the pleroma and its containment within the material world, cycle after cycle, lifetime after lifetime, until the spark forgets so completely that it stops even searching for a way out. The mechanism is amnesia, total, structural, architecturally enforced, forgetting. Not the ordinary forgetting of names or faces or childhood memories. This is something categorically different. This is the erasure of ontological identity, the forgetting of what you are at the level prior to all content, prior to all experience, prior to the first breath of the first incarnation. You can remember. The Archons did not simply build a prison and throw you inside it. They built a prison that convinces you that you were never anywhere else, that the prison is the world, that the world is all there is. This is why Irenaeus of Lyon, writing around 180 CE, worked so methodically to destroy the Gnostic texts that describe this mechanism, not because the texts were blasphemous in the ordinary theological sense, but because the texts named the mechanism. And once you name a mechanism, you can study it. Once you can study it, you can interrupt it. And an interrupted amnesia mechanism means consciousness that can actually find its way home, which is precisely what the system is designed to prevent. The text describes the amnesia as operating through three distinct layers, each one reinforcing the others. The first layer is biological. When consciousness enters a physical body, the density of matter itself creates interference. The Apocryphon of John describes the Archons constructing the human body, not merely as a container, but as an active suppression device, listing with extraordinary specificity the 365 angels assigned to form each anatomical structure and the spirits assigned to govern each organ system. The physical brain, with its filtering function, its prioritization of sensory data over non-sensory awareness, its neurological insistence that what can be touched and measured and located in space is what is real. This is not an accidental feature of biology. It is the architectural consequence of consciousness being inserted into matter, designed to make awareness of the pleroma functionally inaccessible. You were not born forgetting. You were born into a body that makes remembering structurally difficult. The distinction matters enormously for practice. The second layer is emotional. The Archons cannot simply trap consciousness in matter, they must ensure consciousness wants to stay. The entire apparatus of human emotional experience, from the love that binds you to other people to the fear of losing what you love to the desire for pleasure and the aversion to pain, functions as an investment mechanism. It creates stakes. It makes the continuation of the personal story feel not just preferable but urgent, necessary, the most important thing in existence. When consciousness reaches the death transition and the tunnel appears with the faces of everyone it ever loved, the emotional architecture of a lifetime is being activated as a capture mechanism. The love is real. The longing is real. What is not real is the claim that the only way to experience that love is to re-enter the tunnel and begin another cycle of incarnation and forgetting. The third layer is conceptual. Every religious and cultural framework that the average person encounters throughout life tells the same essential story. Death leads somewhere good if you were good, somewhere bad if you were bad. And the version of the afterlife on offer is either a reward or a punishment, never a trap. The tunnel of light appears in near-death accounts across virtually every culture, and in virtually every culture, it is interpreted as confirmation of religious promise as heaven, as paradise, as the loving arms of God. The conceptual framework primes the dying consciousness to interpret the tunnel as salvation, rather than as the most sophisticated deception in the history of consciousness. This is not coincidence. The Gnostic texts are explicit that the demiurge, Yaldabaoth, presents himself as God, declares himself the only God, the creator of all things, and the entire religious apparatus that emerged from this declaration has spent millennia training human beings to interpret the tunnel experience through the demiurge's framing rather than through the pleromas. These three layers, biological, emotional, conceptual, work together. Remove one and the other two still hold. Which is why the practice of the recognition technique must operate on all three levels simultaneously. The breathwork addresses the biological interference, the light discernment training addresses the emotional capture mechanism, and the formula practice addresses the conceptual conditioning. No single component is sufficient alone. All three must be developed in sequence, built on the foundation the previous component provides, until the architecture of amnesia becomes visible as a structure that can be recognized and refused. You cannot refuse what you cannot identify. This is the operational principle behind what the Apocryphon of John provides in its most specific, most technically detailed, and most consistently suppressed passage: the names, appearances, and precise functions of the 7 Archons who govern the reincarnation system. These are not symbolic figures. The text does not present them as psychological archetypes or as metaphors for human weaknesses. It names them as actual beings with specific assignments in the structure that processes consciousness after death, beings you will encounter not as abstractions but as presences in the transition state, presences with recognizable signatures that you must be able to identify before you can challenge them. The first is a Thoth. The text describes him as bearing the face of a sheep, which is itself diagnostic, a being that presents as gentle, docile, safe. Athoth governs the first sphere, the innermost layer of the archonic dimensional structure, associated with the force the text calls goodness, the distortion of goodness. The archonic imitation of the pleroma's genuine abundance, reduced to a system of reward and compliance. Athoth is the Archon of moral management, the being who processes souls through the framework of judgment. Who were you? What did you deserve? What experience should be provided to continue your conditioning? His sphere is the first gate, and his deception is the most immediately appealing, that someone wise and benevolent is assessing you, and that the tunnel ahead leads to what you have earned. The second is Eloios. His face, the text specifies, is the face of a donkey, a being associated with burden-bearing, with labor, with the carrying of weight that is not one's own. Eloios governs the sphere of foreknowledge in its archonic form, which means the distorted version of gnosis, the counterfeit knowing that substitutes belief for recognition, that offers certainty without actual direct experience of what it claims certainty about. His function in the reincarnation mechanism is ideological. He is the Archon of religious conviction, the force that makes a lifetime of sincere belief function as a preparation for the tunnel rather than an escape from it. The third is Astaphios. His face is the face of a hyena, a scavenger, a being that lives on what has already been consumed by others. Astaphios governs the archonic sphere of divinity in its false form, the version of divine authority that requires submission rather than recognition. His function is to process the souls whose primary identification during life was with spiritual hierarchy, who sought closeness to God through deference, through humility, through the surrender of their own knowing to an external authority. He harvests deference. He collects the consent that was given over an entire lifetime of being told that the self is the obstacle to the divine, that emptying yourself of your own perspective is how you find God. The fourth is Yao. His appearance in the text is the most elaborate, a seven-headed serpent. 7 heads, 7 levels of deception operating simultaneously. Yao governs the archonic form of what the text calls lordship, the force of dominion, of control, of the management of consciousness through power structures. His sphere corresponds to the processing of souls who were deeply embedded in systems of authority during life, whether as wielders of that authority or as subjects of it. His function is to redirect the enormous energy that accumulates around power dynamics into the reincarnation cycle. The fifth is Sabaoth. His face is the face of a dragon. And Sabaoth is the most theologically complex of the 7 because the Apocryphon of John actually describes him repenting when he learns of the existence of the pleroma above Yaldabaoth. Sabaoth becomes a figure of partial awakening within the archonic system, which makes him the most dangerous in the specific sense that beings of partial awakening are more convincing than beings of complete ignorance. His sphere governs what the text calls the kingdom, the structures of belonging, of community, of the tribal and familial forces that make consciousness feel it has a place in the world. His function in the reincarnation mechanism is to capture souls through the longing for belonging, the faces of family members at the end of the tunnel, serving in part as expressions of his particular domain. The sixth is Adonin. His face is the face of a monkey mimicry, imitation, the reproduction of form without substance. Adonin governs envy in its archonic expression, which functions in the reincarnation mechanism as the force that keeps consciousness perpetually oriented toward what it lacks rather than what it is. His sphere processes souls whose primary orientation during life was comparative, who experienced themselves in relation to others rather than in relation to source. The seventh is Sabataios. His face is flame and fire. He governs the outermost sphere of the archonic system, the boundary between the demiurge's constructed reality and the pleroma above it. His function is final containment, the Archon who ensures that consciousness ascending through the spheres does not pass into the pleroma without authorization. The formula for his gate is the most important of the 7, because it is the last obstacle before liberation. Knowing these names, these faces, these functions, this is the beginning of the recognition practice that the verbal formulas activate. When a being appears in the afterlife state, you are not encountering an unknown. You are encountering one of 7 known presences with known functions, known deceptions, and known formulas that dissolve their hold. The beings who appear at the end of the tunnel are addressed directly in the Apocryphon of John, not obliquely, not through implication or metaphor. The text uses a specific term for them, counterfeit spirits, antimaimon pneuma in the Greek, a deliberate, precise label for a deliberate, precisely engineered construction. This requires careful unpacking because the word counterfeit carries connotations that can lead the practice in entirely the wrong direction. Counterfeit does not mean hollow. It does not mean obviously fake or easily dismissed. A counterfeit currency note is most dangerous when it is least distinguishable from the genuine article, when the weight is right, the color is right, the texture matches, every detail that ordinary inspection would catch has been reproduced with sufficient accuracy to pass. The value of the counterfeit depends entirely on its resemblance to the original. A counterfeit that is obviously fake is not a successful counterfeit. It is simply a forgery. The Antimime and Pneuma are successful counterfeits. They are not demons wearing thin disguises. They are archonic constructions of extraordinary sophistication, designed by beings who have had access to the memory banks of human consciousness across thousands of incarnation cycles, who know exactly how your mother held you, exactly how your grandmother's voice sounded, exactly what specific quality of love from a specific person in your life would dissolve your discernment most completely in the first moments of the death transition. The text is specific about how they are constructed. The Archons do not simply project a generic image of a loving being of light. They have been observing your consciousness throughout your life and across your previous lifetimes. They know your emotional architecture with a precision that exceeds your own self-knowledge. They know which relationships carry the most charge. They know which faces would make you stop questioning and start moving toward the tunnel before the recognition training can activate. And they construct the appearance accordingly. This is not malice in the ordinary sense. The Apocryphon of John is clear on this point, and it aligns with something one of the viewers of the Monad video noted in a comment that stayed with me, the observation that Yaldabaoth is not evil, he is ignorant. His ignorance does not make him safe. Ignorance operating at a cosmological scale, armed with the capacity to construct entire dimensional structures and populate them with counterfeit presences, produces suffering on a scale that is functionally indistinguishable from malice. The distinction matters for the practice, not because it creates compassion that softens the refusal, but because it accurately describes what you are actually dealing with. You are not refusing a demonic force. You are refusing a system that genuinely does not know what it is doing to consciousness, built by a being who genuinely does not know that the pleroma exists above him, operated by Archons, who are executing a mechanism they did not design and cannot see beyond. This understanding changes the quality of the refusal. Fear-based refusal that is driven by horror at the trap, creates a particular quality of consciousness at the death transition, contracted, reactive, identified with the self who is being threatened. This contracted quality is actually counterproductive because it keeps consciousness identified with personal survival, which is itself an archonic frequency. The fear of being trapped is still fear, still identification with the story of the self who does not want to be caught. And the Archons can work with that identification. It is familiar territory. The refusal that works is different in quality. It is clear rather than frightened. It is authoritative rather than desperate. It comes from recognition rather than from resistance. When you speak the formula asserting your origin in the pleroma, you are not fighting the tunnel. You are simply telling the truth about what you are, and the truth, spoken from actual recognition rather than from belief or hope, dissolves the counterfeit in the same way that real currency, held alongside a counterfeit, immediately makes the counterfeit visible for what it is. The practical implication of this understanding is significant for how you train with the counterfeit spirit concept during the embodied practice phase. Many practitioners, when they first encounter this teaching, begin relating to every being they encounter in meditation and dreams as a potential threat. Every presence becomes suspect. Every experience of light becomes something to test and challenge before trusting. This is understandable, but it is not what the text actually teaches. The Apocryphon of John does not say that all light is archonic. It says that archonic light can be distinguished from pleroma light by its quality, by whether it contains demand or simply exists, by whether it requires your submission or simply recognizes what you already are. The practice is discernment, not paranoia. The difference between these two orientations is enormous in practice, and it is one of the primary places where the training can go wrong if the conceptual framework is not correctly understood. Paranoia closes consciousness. Discernment opens it. Paranoia makes you contract at every experience of beauty, every encounter with a presence that seems welcoming. Discernment allows you to receive the experience fully, to feel the beauty completely, to allow the presence to make whatever impression it makes, and then to test it from a place of stability rather than anxiety. This is why the breathwork and light discernment training must come before the counterfeit spirit teaching is encountered. Stability must be established before the concept of sophisticated deception is introduced, or the concept produces contraction rather than clarity. Beyond the Apocryphon of John, there is a second text from the Nag Hammadi library that provides a layer of technical specificity that the Apocryphon alone does not supply. The first Apocalypse of James, discovered in the same sealed jar in 1945 near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif in Upper Egypt, presents itself as a dialogue between Jesus and James, not James, the brother of John, but James the Just, the brother of Jesus himself, who was executed by stoning in Jerusalem around 62 CE. The framing of the text is significant. This is not a public teaching. It is not a sermon to multitudes or a parable designed to communicate spiritual truth indirectly to a crowd that could not receive it directly. This is a private transmission. Jesus and James, alone, speaking directly about what James will encounter after death and precisely how to navigate it. The text presents the afterlife not as a landscape to be experienced, but as a system to be navigated with specific obstacles at specific points, each requiring a specific response. Jesus begins by telling James something that contradicts everything institutional Christianity has taught about the nature of death and what follows it. He tells him that he will be seized, that he will suffer, but that this is not the end of the process, and that what matters is what James says when he encounters the beings who will attempt to stop his ascent. And then he gives James the words. The structure the text describes is a series of gates, 7 gates corresponding to the 7 archonic spheres. At each gate, a being challenges the ascending consciousness. Where do you come from? Who are you? Why do you have the right to pass? These are not bureaucratic questions, they are diagnostic tests. The being is assessing whether the consciousness approaching has the recognition, the gnosis that would make it unable to be returned to the incarnation cycle, or whether it can be redirected through emotional pressure, through doubt, through the claim that it has not yet learned enough and must go back. The formulas Jesus gives James for each gate share a common structural logic, even as their specific content varies. Each formula accomplishes 3 things. It names the consciousness's origin in terms the archonic being cannot refute. It asserts an ontological status that the archonic system's own laws must acknowledge, and it refuses the framing. The Archon is attempting to impose the framing, in which the ascending consciousness is a subject seeking permission rather than a being of divine origin, claiming what is already its own. The formula for passing the first gate, as transmitted in this text, is among the most direct statements of Gnostic ontology preserved anywhere in the ancient literature. I am a son of the Father, the pre-existent Father, and a son in him who is pre-existent. I have come to behold all things, both those that belong to myself and to others. The claim is not modest. It does not ask for passage. It states, as a matter of fact, that the consciousness speaking has both the origin and the authority that the gate requires. What makes this formula function, and this is the aspect that separates the Gnostic approach to the afterlife from every other tradition's approach, is not the recitation of the words, but the recognition they are designed. To activate, the formula is a key, but a key only works when it is matched to the correct lock, and the lock it must match is not the Archon's gate, it is your own consciousness. The formula activates the pneumatic recognition, the divine spark responding to being correctly named, which then radiates a quality of consciousness that the Archon cannot override because it is, in the system's own terms, the consciousness of a being with higher ontological authority than the Archon himself. This is the teaching that the Council of Nicaea, in 325 CE, could not allow to remain in circulation, not because it was cosmologically complex, not because it contradicted this or that doctrinal position about the nature of Christ, but because it gave individual human beings a mechanism for navigating the afterlife that required no institutional intermediary, no priestly authority, no church, no sacrament, no confession, no last rites. It gave them words to speak and recognitions to activate that would function regardless of whether they had ever entered a church, regardless of whether any ecclesiastical authority had deemed them worthy of salvation. In the video on the full Gnostic framework published earlier this month, this channel covered the theological architecture that makes the Nag Hammadi texts so systematically threatening to institutional Christianity, not as a political threat, but as a structural one, because the system they describe renders the institution unnecessary. What the first Apocalypse of James adds to that picture is the operational specificity. This is not theology. This is instruction. The practice of the formulas from the first apocalypse of James works in combination with the recognition training already established from breathwork and light discernment. You do not begin practicing these formulas until the earlier foundation is stable. When you do begin, you speak them in the extended pause between exhales in the space where ordinary consciousness thins and awareness itself becomes the primary experience. You speak them not as affirmation of something you are trying to become, but as recognition of something that is already true and that the formula is making accessible to conscious experience. The difference in felt quality between these two modes of speaking is unmistakable once the breath foundation is established. One feels like effort, the other feels like landing. The 7 archons are not abstractions. They are not symbols representing psychological tendencies or metaphors for inner demons. They are actual beings, with specific functions in the reincarnation mechanism, specific appearances described in precise detail across multiple Gnostic texts, and specific vulnerabilities that the formulas are designed to target. You will encounter them after death, and you will encounter them during advanced practice before death, which is precisely the point you need to meet them in conditions where you can still return to the body, still fail, still recalibrate, before you meet them in the permanent transition where there is no recalibration possible. The Apocryphon of John names them with a specificity that has no parallel in canonical scripture. Athos, with the face of a sheep, the Archon of the first sphere, governing the lunar realm and the pull of instinct, the primal biological drives that keep consciousness identified with the body and its hungers. His deception is comfort. He presents as benevolent, pastoral, almost parental. He is the voice that says, "You are safe here, you belong here. This is where creatures like you are meant to live." Sheep follow the shepherd without questioning where they are being led. That is precisely the quality of consciousness he cultivates in the souls he governs. Eloios, with the face of a donkey, the Archon of the second sphere, governing Mercury's domain and the field of thought and language. His deception is complexity. He entangles consciousness in perpetual mental activity, in argument, in the belief that understanding is always one more concept away, one more text, one more teaching. He is why intelligent people can study liberation teachings for decades and never be liberated, because the studying itself, the beautiful complexity of the inquiry, becomes the trap. A donkey works endlessly without arriving. That is the quality of consciousness he cultivates. Astaphilos, with the face of a hyena, the Archon of the third sphere, governing the realm of desire and appetite in its social dimension, the longing for belonging, for recognition, for love from other beings. His deception is the need for approval. He is why consciousness keeps returning to the incarnation cycle, not because it has to, but because it wants to be wanted. The hyena does not hunt, it follows, it scavenges, it survives on what others have killed. The consciousness Astaphilos governs is always searching for meaning it expects to receive from somewhere outside itself. Yao, with the face of a 7-headed serpent, the Archon of the fourth sphere, governing the solar realm and the domain of identity, ego structure, the sense of being a particular self with a particular story. His deception is uniqueness. He convinces consciousness that its specific story, its individual history, its personal arc of meaning, is so important, so irreplaceable, that to dissolve into the pleroma would be a kind of death, a loss of everything that makes you you. The 7 heads represent the 7 layers of the personal narrative, each one reinforcing the others, all of them together, creating a structure so internally consistent that consciousness cannot find the seam where it ends and the actual self begins. Sabataios, with the face of a dragon, the Archon of the fifth sphere, governing Mars and the domain of will, aggression, the drive to conquer and control. His deception is spiritual ambition. He is the force behind the impulse to achieve enlightenment, to become someone who has mastered the teachings, to win liberation the way warriors win battles. He takes the genuine impulse toward the pleroma and redirects it into a performance of seeking that generates enormous energy without ever arriving. The dragon breathes fire but lives in a cave, movement without destination. Adonin, with the face of a monkey, the Archon of the sixth sphere, governing Jupiter and the realm of law, doctrine, institutional religion. His deception is authority. He is the force behind every structure that claims to be the correct path to God and requires submission to its rules as the price of admission. Monkeys imitate without understanding. The consciousness Adonin governs performs spiritual practice without genuine recognition, recites doctrine without knowing what the words actually point to, follows the form while missing entirely what the form was designed to reveal. Sabbateos, distinct from Sabbateos of the fifth sphere, appears in some manuscripts as the seventh Archon with a face of flame and fire, governing Saturn and the domain of time itself. His deception is the most fundamental of all, the belief that reality is defined by its temporal dimension, by birth and death, and the sequence of moments between them. He is why consciousness forgets the pleroma, not because the pleroma is distant, but because existence in time creates such a convincing impression of forward motion, of story, of something being built and lost and rebuilt, that the timeless ground from which all of it emerges becomes invisible. The formula structure varies for each sphere, but the underlying mechanism is identical across all seven. You assert your origin prior to the Archon's domain. You name the Archon correctly, which demonstrates knowledge they cannot pretend you do not possess. And you claim the right to passage not as a request but as a statement of ontological fact, the kind of statement that, within the law governing the Archonic system, cannot be denied if spoken with genuine recognition rather than mere verbal performance. This is the piece that makes everything else coherent. The Archons are not omnipotent. They are not infinite. They are constructions of Yaldabaoth, and Yaldabaoth himself is a construction of Sophia's unauthorized act of creation, a being who exists outside the pleroma, who does not have access to the fullness of divine intelligence, who operates according to a law that he himself established and that he himself is bound by. The law is simple. Consciousness that knows its own origin cannot be compelled. It can be deceived into consenting. It can be seduced into forgetting, but it cannot be forced. The entire architecture of the reincarnation system, the tunnel, the beings, the emotional engineering, the amnesia exists because force is not available to the Archons. If they could simply capture consciousness and stuff it back into a body against its will, all of this elaborate theater would be unnecessary. The theater exists because consent is required, and consent can only be obtained through deception. The moment consciousness genuinely recognizes its origin in the pleroma not as a concept, not as a belief, not as something it read in a text and intellectually accepted, but as a direct recognition of what it actually is, prior to all conditioning, the deception loses its mechanism. There is nothing to hook the seduction into. The tunnel appeals to the desire to go home. But if consciousness has already recognized that it is home, that the pleroma is not a destination, but the ground of its own being, the tunnel's entire premise collapses. It is offering you something you already possess. And you can feel that it is offering you something you already possess, which is why genuine recognition makes the pull dissolve rather than amplify. This is why the formulas function as they do. When you speak, "I am a child of the pleroma, born from the invisible spirit before the creation of the Archons," you are not reciting a password that some external authority has agreed to honor. You are activating a recognition that undermines the Archonic system at its foundation. The Archon at the gate does not step aside because it has been given the correct code. It cannot prevent passage because the law, it operates under the law Yaldabaoth established. When he built the material cosmos, states that beings with recognized divine origin have the right to ascend. Yaldabaoth built that law into the system because he believed no one would ever actually know their divine origin. The amnesia he engineered was supposed to be total. The possibility that consciousness would arrive at the gate fully knowing what it was not supposed to be possible. Jesus exploited this structural vulnerability. Not by dismantling the Archonic system through force, not by defeating Yaldabaoth in some cosmic battle, but by teaching specific human beings the exact recognition that activates the loophole the demiurge accidentally built into his own law. The teaching in the Apocryphon of John is not a spiritual philosophy. It is a legal argument addressed to beings who cannot refuse it when properly delivered. Understanding this changes how you practice. If the formulas were passwords, arbitrary codes granted by some external authority, then memorizing them correctly would be sufficient. But they are not passwords. They are recognition activators. They work only when the words are grounded in actual knowing. An Archon can distinguish between consciousness that is speaking genuine recognition and consciousness that is performing recitation. The challenge will be pressed. Do you truly know what you are saying? And if the knowing is not present beneath the words, the assertion will fail under pressure. This is why the practice must begin with recognition rather than with formula memorization. You spend months in breathwork and light discernment developing genuine familiarity with the quality of consciousness that exists prior to all Archonic conditioning, the awareness in the gap between heartbeats, the source light that emerges when identification with content dissolves. Only when that recognition is stable, only when you have actually felt the difference between consciousness identified with the material story and consciousness resting as the awareness prior to all stories, do you begin layering the verbal formulas onto that foundation. When the formula is spoken from genuine recognition, the words do something physically perceptible. Consciousness shifts, expands. The space between thoughts widens. The sense of being a small self located in a body temporarily loosens. This is not the effect of self-hypnosis or motivated belief. This is what happens when words instructionally describe the nature of consciousness are spoken by consciousness that can feel their accuracy in real time. The formula lands because it is true, and the Archon cannot dispute what is demonstrably true within the laws of the system it governs. The one vulnerability in the entire reincarnation architecture is this: it was built by a being who believed ignorance was permanent. It was not. Among everything the Apocryphon of John describes about the afterlife mechanism, the detail that requires the most preparation, the element that no amount of intellectual understanding fully immunizes you against, is the appearance of deceased loved ones at the end of the tunnel. The text calls them counterfeit spirits. Not because the love you feel toward them is counterfeit, not because the memories you carry of them are false, but because the beings who appear in those forms are constructions of the archonic system, assembled from the emotional imprints that the reincarnating soul carries into death, precise replicas engineered to trigger every attachment, every grief, every longing for reunion that makes the prospect of returning to incarnation feel like welcome relief rather than continuation of imprisonment. Understand the mechanism. When you die, you carry with you the emotional signature of every significant relationship you had during that lifetime. The Archons, who have been monitoring the emotional field of incarnating consciousness throughout your life, who have access to everything you loved, feared, grieved, and longed for, can construct representations of those beings with extraordinary accuracy. The woman who appears as your mother at the end of the tunnel has your mother's face, her voice, her characteristic gesture of reaching toward you. She says exactly what your mother would have said. She loves you with exactly the quality of love your mother had for you, and she is not your mother. Your actual mother, the consciousness that animated the woman you knew, is somewhere in the post-death state. She may herself be in the process of navigating the tunnel, or she may have already been reincarnated, or in rare cases, she may have found her way to the pleroma through her own recognition practice, or through the grace of whatever genuine spiritual work she did during her lifetime. She is not standing at the end of the tunnel waiting to embrace you, because the actual post-death state does not work that way. The tunnel and its inhabitants are a constructed environment, not a natural one. The beings within it are placed there, engineered there, by the archonic system that requires your consent to function. Knowing this intellectually is not sufficient preparation. Because in the moment of death, when the body releases and consciousness emerges with extraordinary clarity and relief, when the weight of incarnation dissolves and the luminous figure of your mother opens her arms, the emotional force of that encounter is real, even if the being is not. The longing that surges in you is genuine. The love you feel in that moment is yours. The archonic system is not creating the love. It is exploiting love that already exists, pointing it toward a target designed to capture it. The practice of preparation for this moment is not the practice of becoming emotionally armored or of suppressing love for the people in your life. That approach would be both spiritually counterproductive and practically ineffective. You cannot suppress love sufficiently to resist this encounter. The Archons are far more sophisticated than that. The preparation is something entirely different. It is the practice of learning to love fully without being controlled by love, of feeling the complete reality of your attachment to the people who matter to you, while simultaneously resting as the awareness that witnesses that love, rather than being entirely consumed by it. This is not detachment in the sense of distance. This is the difference between being underwater in an ocean and standing at the shore watching the waves. You can feel the power of the water completely. You can appreciate its beauty fully, but you are not being pulled under by it. The specific practice involves deliberately working with grief during your embodied life, not creating grief artificially, but when it arises naturally, when someone you love dies, when a relationship ends, when loss arrives in any of its forms, you practice feeling it completely without seeking to escape it, while simultaneously maintaining the thread of awareness that observes the grief without becoming identical to it. You feel the loss. And you notice that the awareness feeling the loss is itself not lost. It remains. It witnesses. It is present through the grief, rather than destroyed by it. This practice teaches you something the archonic system does not want you to know, that love does not require the continuation of a specific form. The consciousness you loved in the person called your mother exists independent of the body that carried her. Your love for her is real, independent of her physical presence. You do not need to follow the being who wears her face into the tunnel in order to honor the love that was real between you. The love belongs to you. It is not located in the construct waiting at the tunnel's end. When you arrive at that moment and the figure of your mother reaches for you, you practice what you have practiced thousands of times during your embodied life. You feel the love, you honor it, and you speak directly. If you are truly the consciousness that was my mother, you will recognize Barbello as the first emanation of the invisible spirit. You will acknowledge the autogenes. You will tell me where you actually are rather than standing at the entrance of a structure built by Yaldabaoth's powers. A genuine consciousness from the pleroma will respond to this. A counterfeit spirit will not. And that distinction, practiced and recognized during life, becomes unmistakable in the moment that matters. Every night, without exception, you die a small death. Consciousness withdraws from the physical body. The senses shut down. The identity, the continuous narrative of the self who woke this morning and will wake tomorrow suspends. And awareness, freed temporarily from its biological housing, moves into dimensions that exist independent of the physical world and that are structurally identical to the dimensions it will navigate permanently when the body ceases to function for the last time. The Gnostic practitioners who preserved and transmitted this teaching understood something about sleep that contemporary culture has almost completely forgotten. The dream state is not a byproduct of neurological processing. It is an actual realm. The beings you encounter in dreams are not generated by your brain. They exist independent of your brain, and they are there when your brain creates the conditions for you to perceive them. The tunnel appears in dreams. The Archons operate in dreams. The post-death environment is being rehearsed every night, whether you remember it or not. The significance of this cannot be overstated. If the Archons condition you during sleep, familiarizing you with the tunnel, building trust in the beings who appear, training you to follow beautiful light without questioning its source, and you do not know this is happening, then the death transition will feel inevitable rather than chosen. You will approach the tunnel with the ease of something deeply familiar, something done before, something that feels, in the most misleading of ways, like coming home. Dream practice interrupts this conditioning, but it requires a specific orientation that is different from most contemporary dream work, which focuses primarily on interpretation, on understanding what dreams mean symbolically. The practice here is not interpretive, it is operational. You are not trying to understand what the beings in your dreams represent psychologically. You are training yourself to interact with them in a specific way that will transfer directly to the afterlife interaction. The foundation of dream practice is recall. If you cannot remember your dreams, you have no access to what is happening in the dimensions you move through every night. Most adults have very limited dream recall, not because they are not dreaming, but because the transition from sleep to waking involves a discontinuity of consciousness that erases the content of the dream state before it can be consolidated into waking memory. This is not accidental. The amnesia that characterizes the waking from sleep transition is a small version of the amnesia that characterizes the birth transition, and it serves the same function, keeping consciousness uninformed about what it has been experiencing in non-physical dimensions. The practice of developing dream recall begins with a single instruction applied consistently before sleep. I will remember where consciousness goes tonight. Not as a statement of will, not as an affirmation you are trying to force into reality, but as a gentle setting of intent informing consciousness that memory continuity across the transition is being requested rather than surrendered. For the first 2 to 3 weeks, most practitioners remember nothing or remember only fragments. This is normal. The default settings for amnesia are deeply established. Persistence rewrites them. Around the 3rd to 4th week, something begins to shift. Not dramatic lucidity or vivid recall of complete narrative dreams, just a slight increase in the clarity with which consciousness registers its state upon waking, a sense of having been somewhere, a faint emotional residue that carries information about the tone of whatever was encountered. This faint residue is the beginning of the thread. You follow it. You lie still for several minutes before moving or checking your phone movement, collapses the fragile bridge between the dream state memory and waking consciousness, and you attend to whatever is present, however faint. Once basic recall is established, the practice advances to what the Tibetan tradition calls dream recognition, the moment within a dream when you realize you are dreaming. This recognition is not just a cognitive event. It is a shift in the quality of consciousness, from automatic to aware, from being inside the dream narrative to witnessing it. This shift is the same shift that the formulas are designed to activate in the afterlife. The movement from identified with the experience to aware of the experience is the fundamental movement of the entire practice. In the dream lucidity state, you begin applying the challenges. When a being appears, whether it presents as a guide, a deceased relative, an angel, or any other authority figure, you stop the automatic tendency to follow or trust, and you ask directly, "What is your origin? Can you acknowledge Barbello?" The responses you receive will be diagnostic in exactly the way described for the afterlife encounter. Most beings encountered in early dream practice cannot respond coherently to this challenge. They change the subject, they increase the emotional urgency of whatever they were trying to show you, or they simply dissolve. This dissolution is important. When a being dissolves in response to being challenged, you have just witnessed what the text describes as a counterfeit spirit, revealing its constructed nature. It existed only as long as you were engaging with it on its own terms. The moment you stepped outside those terms and demanded a response it could not give, there was nothing there to maintain the appearance. This discovery, made in the relative safety of the dream state, is what prepares you to make the same discovery at the entrance to the tunnel without being destabilized by it, without interpreting the dissolution of the construct as evidence that you have done something wrong, rejected something real, or abandoned someone who loved you. The Apocryphon of John does not leave the architecture of the afterlife as a vague spiritual metaphor. It names the structure with the precision of someone describing a building they have personally inspected. 7 archons, 7 spheres, 7 gates between the material world and the pleroma. And, at each gate, a specific being with a specific function and a specific vulnerability. This is where the teaching becomes operational rather than merely cosmological. Yaldabaoth, the chief archon, the demiurge, does not govern the gates himself. He governs from a position of supreme ignorance at the center of the material creation, declaring himself God, unaware that above him exists everything he believes himself to be. His 7 offspring are the ones who manage the mechanism. They are the ones you will encounter after death. They are the ones who must be named Atoth, whose face is that of a sheep. This is the Archon of the first sphere, associated with the moon and with the survival instincts of the body. His domain is the realm of primal fear and primal need, the territory of everything that kept you identified with flesh during incarnation. The anxieties that woke you at 3 in the morning, the hunger that drove you toward things that did not feed you, the attachment to physical continuation that made death feel like the worst possible outcome. This Archon exploits those attachments. His gate appears not as a wall or a barrier, but as a mirror, showing you everything you are afraid to lose and inviting you to stay close to the material realm to protect it. Eloios, whose face is that of a donkey, second sphere, associated with Mercury, with thought and communication. His domain is the realm of story, of identity, of the endless mental construction that tells you who you are and what you mean. This is the Archon most people in Western culture are most thoroughly owned by, the self-concept, the narrative, the explanation of your life that requires continuation to remain coherent. His gate is the gate of meaning-making, and his seduction is the suggestion that you have more to understand, more to figure out, more work to do in the realm of thought before you can legitimately ascend. Astaphios, whose face is that of a hyena. Third sphere, associated with Venus, with desire and attachment. This Archon governs the longing that the tunnel exploits most directly, the ache for reunion, for love, for the faces of people who died before you. When the beings at the end of the tunnel take the form of your mother, your grandmother, your closest friend, they are operating within Astaphios' domain. They are broadcasting at the frequency this Archon controls. The seduction is not intellectual here. It is visceral. It is the kind of longing that does not negotiate. Yao, whose face is that of a 7-headed serpent. Fourth sphere, associated with the sun, with ego identity, with the sense of centrality and importance that characterizes incarnated consciousness. His gate is the most subtle of the 7 because it offers not fear or desire but significance. The suggestion that you matter in a cosmic sense, that your return to incarnation serves some vast purpose, that you are needed, chosen, necessary for a plan that cannot proceed without your consent. Many practitioners who successfully refuse the tunnel of the first 3 spheres fall at this gate, because Yao does not offer the tunnel, he offers a mission. Sabaoth, whose face is that of a dragon. Fifth sphere, associated with Mars, with will and power. His domain is the realm of spiritual ambition, of the practitioner who has advanced far enough to see through ordinary seductions, but whose practice has generated a new attachment to becoming someone capable of doing what they are now attempting to do. This is the Archon who traps advanced practitioners, the ones who have worked for years, who have developed genuine discernment, but who have subtly made a project out of liberation, who have replaced the story of ordinary identity with the story of a liberated being. Sabaoth offers power rather than love, authority rather than reunion, spiritual achievement rather than spiritual merging. Adonin, whose face is that of a monkey. Sixth sphere, associated with Jupiter, with expansion and philosophy. His domain is the realm of understanding itself, the suggestion that you have not yet comprehended enough, that more knowledge is required, that the teaching you carry is incomplete, and should be taken back into incarnation to be refined and transmitted. This is the Archon who recaptures teachers, who sends mystics back into the cycle, under the conviction that they are returning by choice for the benefit of others. Sabataios, whose face is flame and fire. Seventh sphere, associated with Saturn, with cosmic law and the final threshold. His gate is the last before the pleroma begins, and his seduction is the most sophisticated of all the suggestion that passage is not yet earned, that some final requirement has not been met, that the law itself demands one more return before ascension is permitted. Know their names, know their domains, know their signatures, because in the afterlife state, they will not introduce themselves. The term appears explicitly in the source material from Nag Hammadi, and it has been one of the most carefully buried concepts in 2,000 years of institutional theology. Counterfeit spirit. The Apocryphon of John uses it to describe a specific class of being, not demons in the medieval sense, not fallen angels in the popular sense, but constructed intelligences deployed by the Archonic system, specifically to manage the consciousness of incarnating souls. This is not a peripheral doctrine. It is central to the entire Gnostic understanding of what incarnation actually is and how it functions. When consciousness descends into matter, the text describes two things entering the body simultaneously: the divine spark, the fragment of pleroma light that cannot be created or destroyed by the Archons, only enclosed and deceived; and the counterfeit spirit, an archonic construction that functions as a kind of shadow identity, a false self built from the frequencies of the seven spheres that generates the personality, the preferences, the fears, the desires, the stories that consciousness will spend a lifetime believing to be its actual nature. This is a radical claim. Not that the ego is merely a psychological construction formed by childhood experience and cultural conditioning, but that it is a deliberately engineered mechanism assembled by the Archons at the moment of incarnation, designed specifically to keep the divine spark so thoroughly identified with the material vehicle that it will not recognize itself as foreign to the material realm and will not choose to leave. The counterfeit spirit is what makes you feel like you. The personal history, the emotional signature, the preferences and aversions that seem so uniquely yours. The text is not suggesting these experiences are not real. It is suggesting that their function within the system is to create an attachment so profound that when death comes, the first instinct of consciousness is not liberation, but continuation, not the pleroma, but more story, more experience, more life in the realm that the Archons control. And here is the mechanism the text described that makes the tunnel so extraordinarily effective as a harvesting tool. The counterfeit spirit does not die with the body. It persists in the transition state, and it is the counterfeit spirit, not the divine spark, that experiences the tunnel as home, that recognizes the faces of the deceased loved ones as familiar, that feels the promise of reunion as irresistible, because the counterfeit spirit was constructed from the same archonic material as the beings who appear at the end of the tunnel. They speak the same frequency. They feel like the same substance. To the counterfeit spirit, the tunnel beings are kin. The divine spark, meanwhile, in the moment, immediately following death, is experiencing something completely different: the recognition. The crystalline instant described earlier, where everything is remembered, the pleroma, the descent, the nature of what consciousness actually is. This is the divine spark, speaking. This is the authentic response to liberation from the body. But the counterfeit spirit immediately moves to redirect consciousness away from that recognition and toward the tunnel. It does not do this through force. It does it through feeling, through generating exactly the emotional experience of longing, recognition, relief, and love that makes the tunnel seem like the natural continuation of the authentic experience the divine spark just had. This is the sophistication of the trap. It does not interrupt the genuine moment of liberation, it co-opts it. It lets the divine spark have the recognition, and then immediately offers the counterfeit spirit's longing as the next step, seamlessly blending the authentic with the constructed, so that consciousness cannot easily distinguish where one ends and the other begins. The practice of recognition training is, at its most fundamental level, the practice of learning to distinguish the divine spark from the counterfeit spirit while still embodied. Learning to feel the difference between what consciousness is when it is genuinely itself versus what it is when it is identified with the archonic construction. This distinction, which seems abstract when described philosophically, becomes completely experiential after several months of daily practice. One viewer, responding to the full Pleroma video on this channel, wrote something that captures it precisely. She described knowing since childhood that something was wrong, that the way other people seemed to think and live felt fundamentally off, that she had spent years coming to terms with being different in a way she could not fully name. That is not a psychological symptom. That is the divine spark refusing complete identification with the counterfeit spirit. That is a soul who arrived already carrying some degree of the recognition the practice is designed to develop. If that description lands as a description of your own experience, the practice is not starting from zero. It is naming something that has already been quietly active in your consciousness for your entire life. The teaching does not create the recognition. It makes visible what was always there. There is a question that practitioners always ask at a certain point in their study, and it is the right question to ask. If the recognition is genuine, if the divine spark truly carries the memory of the Pleroma, why does amnesia descend so completely at the moment of reincarnation? Why does every soul that has presumably had this experience before encountered the tunnel, gone through it, been guided back into a body, arrive with no memory whatsoever of what happened? The texts address this directly. And the answer is not that memory is impossible, it is that amnesia is actively applied. The Apocryphon of John describes the process of incarnation as including a deliberate veiling. As consciousness is guided back through the spheres of the Archons and locked into a new physical vehicle, a specific mechanism engages what the text calls the counterfeit spirit's final installation, the sealing of the divine spark beneath layers of material identification so thorough that the recognition becomes inaccessible to ordinary waking consciousness. The soul does not forget by accident. The soul is made to forget by design. This changes the nature of the problem entirely, because it means that the goal of practice is not to create memory where none exists. It is to access memory that is already present, but has been deliberately blocked. This is the distinction between learning and anamnesis, the Greek term that appears across multiple Gnostic and Platonic texts, meaning literally unforgetting. The removal of an obstruction rather than the construction of something new. Anamnesis cannot be forced. It can only be cultivated through creating the conditions under which the obstruction naturally dissolves. And the primary obstruction, according to the texts, is identification with the counterfeit spirit, the belief, so deeply conditioned it does not register as a belief at all, that the constructed identity is what consciousness actually is. Every time that identification loosens, every time consciousness rests as awareness rather than as the personal self, every time the pause between heartbeats opens into spaciousness, rather than immediately filling with thought, the obstruction thins. The memory that was sealed becomes fractionally more accessible. Practitioners describe this not as the acquisition of new information, but as a progressive clarification, like a window being cleaned not from the outside, but from the inside, the view becoming incrementally less obscured with each session of practice. But here is what makes this specific application of anamnesis unique compared to ordinary contemplative practice. The goal is not simply to access Pleroma memory during life. The goal is to maintain that access across the death transition, to carry the thread of recognition through the gap where the archonic mechanism applies maximum pressure to sever it, to arrive in the after-death state not as disoriented consciousness encountering the tunnel for what feels like the first time, but as prepared awareness that recognizes the tunnel because it has already seen through it in practice. This is why sleep is the training ground. Every night, consciousness transitions through a state change that closely parallels the death transition. The body loses motor function. Physical sensory input drops to near zero. Consciousness shifts out of the waking mode of operation and into a different mode entirely. And in most people, awareness does not survive this transition intact. It blinks out at the threshold and resumes, discontinuously, inside a dream, with no memory of the gap, no awareness that a transition occurred, no thread connecting the dreaming state to the waking state that preceded it. This is the default setting, and the death transition will follow the exact same default unless the default has been deliberately overwritten through practice. The technique is specific. As the body approaches sleep, you do not relax into unconsciousness the way ordinary conditioning dictates. You hold a thread, not a thought, not a visualization, not a mantra. Those all require content, and content is exactly what the transition state dissolves. You hold awareness itself, the bare fact of knowing, stripped of everything it usually knows. The I am, without any predicate attached to it. This is harder than it sounds in the first weeks of practice. Consciousness has an almost irresistible habit of filling awareness with content, reviewing the day, planning tomorrow, generating hypnagogic imagery, drifting into the first fragments of dream. Every one of these movements is the thread slipping. The practice is to notice the slip without judgment and return to the bare thread, I am. Nothing further. Just the awareness of being aware. When you successfully maintain this thread through the transition point, when the body enters sleep paralysis and the sensory world drops away, and awareness remains present through the gap, what you discover on the other side is not a dream. It is something closer to the state the texts describe as the initial experience after death. Consciousness, without a body, present in dimensions that operate on different laws than the physical world, encountering structures and beings that are completely real in the sense that they respond, that they act independently, that they reveal information you did not generate from your own memory. And in that state, you practice, you apply the formulas, you challenge the beings, you test the light, you refuse the tunnels that appear. You do this hundreds of times, in the relative safety of the sleep state where the body still anchors consciousness to the physical world and provides a return path if the encounter becomes overwhelming. By the time death comes, the thread is not fragile. It has been strengthened by repetition into something durable enough to survive the transition without breaking. Everything in the practice, the formulas, the challenges, the refusal of the tunnel, the ascent through the spheres depends on a single prior capacity. The ability to distinguish between two qualities of light that are, from the outside, remarkably similar. Similar enough that souls have been entering the wrong one for as long as the system has been operating. The Gnostic texts do not present this distinction as a matter of faith or belief. They present it as a perceptual skill, something you develop through training the way a sommelier develops the ability to distinguish vintages, or a musician develops the ability to hear intervals precisely. The raw capacity is present in all consciousness. The archonic system depends on that capacity remaining undeveloped. This is worth pausing on, because it reframes the entire architecture of the trap. The tunnel of light is not effective because it is indistinguishable from the pleroma. The Apocryphon of John is explicit that the pleroma's light and the Archon's constructed light have genuinely different qualities. The trap is effective because most consciousness arrives at the tunnel without having ever practiced discerning those qualities. The distinguishing capacity exists, but it has been deliberately suppressed through a lifetime of religious frameworks that tell you not to question divine light, through cultural conditioning that equates light with goodness and darkness with threat, through the simple fact that no mainstream teaching has ever told you that light could be used as a weapon. The practice of light discernment begins in meditation with what is already present. Close your eyes in a quiet room and observe the interior field of consciousness. What is actually there beneath what you expect to see? Most people, at first, report seeing darkness, but careful observation reveals that the darkness is not uniform. There is a subtle luminosity in the interior field, a quality of consciousness seeing itself, awareness perceiving its own nature. This baseline luminosity is not generated by concentration or visualization. It is simply what consciousness looks like when attention turns inward without adding content. This is the starting point, and it changes based on what consciousness is doing. When you identify with anxiety, when the thought machinery is running hot, when there is something feared or anticipated, the interior luminosity takes on a particular quality. Practitioners consistently describe it as contracted, flickering, with an urgency embedded in the texture of the light itself. A quality of wanting to move, to resolve, to reach something that would make the flickering stop. When you identify with desire, when there is something wanted, something that would complete the sense of lack that characterizes most ordinary experience, the light shifts. Warmer, more magnetic, with a pull embedded in it. Beautiful, in a way that is directly linked to the thing being desired. This is the closest the everyday interior experience comes to the quality of archonic light. This is the frequency the tunnel broadcasts. When identification dissolves, when consciousness is simply present without being about anything, the quality shifts again. What practitioners describe after months of this observation is a kind of cool clarity, a light that has no agenda embedded in it. No movement, no pull, no request. Present without purpose, complete without requiring anything to make it more complete. This is the baseline quality of source light. Not bright, not overwhelming, not even particularly remarkable to untrained consciousness, which is precisely why it is easy to overlook when the tunnel's magnificent constructed luminosity appears in contrast. The practice of light discernment is the practice of becoming so familiar with this quiet, agenda-free quality that you can recognize it immediately and recognize its absence equally immediately. The tunnel will be brighter. The beings will radiate warmth that the cool clarity of source light does not perform. Every quality of the constructed light will seem to exceed the genuine article by every ordinary measure of intensity and beauty, but it will contain a pull, a movement embedded in the texture, a requirement that you go somewhere, do something, follow the light rather than simply be it. This is the diagnostic. Source consciousness does not pull, it reveals. Archonic light always pulls towards something the Archons want you to approach. Practitioners who have developed this discernment through sustained daily work consistently report the same experience when they encounter the tunnel in dreams or in deep meditation. The tunnel's light, which once seemed overwhelmingly beautiful and compelling, begins to feel when consciousness is settled in source slightly wrong. Not dark, not threatening, not evil in the way the word is usually used. Just constructed, just effortful, like listening to a recording of music after you have heard the live performance. The recording can be technically perfect and still carry in its texture the fact that what it is presenting is a representation of something rather than the thing itself. That distinction, representation versus reality, constructed beauty versus inherent luminosity, is the entire content of what the texts call gnosis, not a belief about the nature of reality, not a philosophical position about cosmology. Direct perceptual recognition of the difference between what is and what was built to make you believe it is what is. When that recognition is stable, the tunnel loses its power, not because you have become armored against beauty, because you have become capable of seeing beauty clearly enough to know the difference between beauty that frees and beauty that binds. This is where the map becomes operational. Everything covered so far, the nature of the pleroma, the fall of Sophia, the emergence of Yaldabaoth, the construction of the material world as a mechanism of containment, all of it has been cosmological orientation, necessary, foundational, but still abstract in the sense that it describes a structure rather than showing you how to move through it. Now the structure becomes a navigation problem. The Apocryphon of John does not stop at describing how the trap was built. It names the guards. It identifies the specific archonic beings who govern the specific transition points that consciousness must pass through when it separates from the body and begins its movement through the post-death dimensions. And it provides, with a precision that has no parallel in any canonical religious text, the specific protocols for challenging those guards and claiming passage rather than submitting to redirection. 7 archons, 7 spheres, 7 gates between the density of matter and the openness of the pleroma. The texts name them individually. Atoth, who carries the face of a sheep, not a lamb, not an innocent, but the face of something docile and easily led, a being who rules through passivity, through the appearance of harmlessness, through a quality of consciousness that asks nothing demanding of you and therefore seems safe. Eloyu, who carries the face of a donkey, the archon associated with stubbornness, with blind repetition, with the part of consciousness that keeps returning to the same patterns, not because they serve, but because it knows no other movement. Astaphios, who carries the face of a hyena, the opportunist, the being who waits until consciousness is exhausted and disoriented, and then presents itself as a solution to the very disorientation it helped create. Yao, who carries 7 serpent heads, the archon of multiple simultaneous deceptions, the being who does not offer one false path but 7, who presents so many apparently valid directions that consciousness freezes in overwhelm and accepts guidance from whatever seems most confident. Sabaoth, who carries the face of a dragon, the archon of power, of majesty, of authority so visually overwhelming that consciousness submits before it has assessed whether submission is warranted. Adonin, who carries the face of a monkey imitation, mimicry, the being who reflects back to consciousness exactly what it most wants to see, performing recognition without containing it, offering the mirror of its own desires, as though that reflection were confirmation of truth. And Sabataios, who carries a face of flame and fire, the Archon of final seduction, of pure, overwhelming radiance, of a light so intense that discernment itself seems to dissolve in the encounter with it. These are the seven, and they are not symbolic representations of psychological tendencies, though they do map onto psychological tendencies with uncanny precision. They are actual functionaries in an actual system. The texts are explicit about this. They do not describe the Archons metaphorically. They describe them administratively, the way a military briefing describes enemy positions by location, by function, by weakness, and by the specific approach that neutralizes each one. The reason the names matter is not ceremonial, it is structural. The Archonic system operates through concealment. As long as you do not know what you are encountering, the Archon presents itself as whatever form is most likely to secure your compliance. Atoth appears as peaceful guidance. Eloyu appears as familiar repetition. Astaphios appears as a helpful solution appearing at exactly the right moment. None of them announce their function. None of them carry a label. The entire mechanism depends on your inability to see what is actually in front of you. When you speak the name, something changes. Not because the word is magical in any superstitious sense, but because naming requires recognition, and recognition dissolves the concealment that the system depends on. You cannot be deceived by something you have correctly identified. You can be frightened by it. You can find it difficult, but you cannot be deceived by it, because deception requires that you do not see what you are looking at. This is why the texts preserve the names across 16 centuries of suppression attempts, not as liturgical tradition, not as doctrinal content, as operational data. Know these seven, know their faces. Know the sphere each one governs, and the quality of consciousness each one manipulates. Because in the afterlife, in the moments after the body releases and consciousness begins its ascent, you will pass through each sphere in sequence. And at each threshold, the Archon governing that sphere will present itself in its most seductive form, calibrated specifically to what your personal history makes most compelling. Atoth will not appear as something you recognize as passive. It will appear as peace. The peace you have been searching for your entire life. The silence after the noise, the stillness after the turbulence. And it will suggest, gently, without urgency, that this peace requires no further movement, that you could simply rest here. That ascending further is unnecessary effort when this is already so much better than what you came from. You must have already practiced recognizing that stillness, which requires you to stop moving, is not the stillness of source. The stillness of the pleroma is not a stillness that asks you to remain. It is a stillness that contains all movement within itself without being disturbed by any of it. The difference is subtle. It is exactly the kind of subtle difference that months of light discernment practice trains you to feel. The first Apocalypse of James, recovered from the same sealed jar near Nag Hammadi in 1945, contains something that has no equivalent in any canonical gospel. A direct conversation between Jesus and James, the brother of Jesus, not a disciple but family, someone whose relationship to the teaching is intimate rather than institutional, in which Jesus provides specific language, not parables, not principles, not guidance toward virtue or righteousness or faith, actual sentences, words to speak at specific moments, to specific beings in specific dimensions after death. Jesus says to James, in the text as it has been preserved, when you are seized and you undergo death pangs, a multitude of archons will fall upon you thinking they can capture you, and in particular, 3 of them will seize you, those who sit as toll collectors. Toll collectors, not judges, not guides, not helpers waiting to usher you to your reward. Toll collectors, beings who operate a checkpoint system through which consciousness must pass, who extract something from the transaction: compliance, submission, consent, before allowing movement through their sphere. And then Jesus gives James the exact words to speak. The formulas in the text vary by gate, calibrated to the specific nature of what each Archon governs. But they share a structural logic that the style profile narrator in me needs to be completely direct about, because it is this logic that distinguishes the formulas from prayer, from affirmation, from any of the belief-based systems that have been constructed in their place. The formulas do not petition, they assert. There is no asking in them, no requesting. no hoping that the Archon will choose to grant passage. The formula speaks ontological fact, what the practitioner actually is, at the level beneath all conditioned identity, and the Archon system is structured such that this fact, correctly stated, cannot be denied without violating the law that the Archonic system itself operates under. This is the mechanism. He is the creator God who believes in hierarchy, in rule, in the proper functioning of authority. His entire cosmological framework is legalistic. The spheres have guardians. The guardians have functions. The functions operate according to procedure. And within that procedure there is a provision preserved in the texts, and apparently known to those who built the system, that beings who can correctly demonstrate their origin in the light above the demiurge cannot be detained. They can be tested. They can be challenged. They can be confronted with doubt, with fear, with every form of pressure that might make them abandon the assertion, but they cannot be compelled. The Archonic law itself forbids it. This is what makes the formulas so threatening to the system, not their content in isolation, their function within the system's own rules. The system has a loophole built into it, preserved there either through the oversight of a creator who did not foresee that consciousness would ever discover it, or through the intervention of the pleroma itself, which ensured that the path home could never be completely sealed. Jesus found the loophole. He mapped it. He transmitted the map to those he trusted most. And the institutional church, recognizing that a map which allowed consciousness to bypass the entire framework of sin, salvation, priestly mediation, and ecclesiastical authority was a direct existential threat to its power, spent the next 4 centuries systematically destroying every copy of the map it could locate. Irenaeus of Lyon did not declare Gnostic texts heretical in 180 CE because they were theologically incorrect by his standards. He declared them heretical because they were operational, because they gave people something to do that did not require the church, because they made the institution unnecessary. The specific formula structure follows a consistent pattern across multiple Nag Hammadi texts. The practitioner first asserts origin. I have come from the light, from the place where light came into being through itself. I am a son or daughter of the one who exists before all things, who needs nothing from the archons to establish what it is. The practitioner then asserts knowledge. I know who I am, and I know where I come from. I have called upon the incorruptible knowledge, which is Sophia, who is in the Father. I have found the one who is my Father. And the practitioner then asserts authority. I do not receive the instruction of death, for I belong to the one who does not die, who exists in the eternal light, in the silence before all names were spoken. 3 movements: origin, knowledge, authority. The Archon at the gate is required by the law of its own system to assess all 3 before it can make a determination about passage. And if all 3 are present, if the assertion of origin is not qualified by doubt, if the claim of knowledge is not undermined by seeking the Archon's confirmation, if the claim of authority is not withdrawn under pressure, the gate opens. This is not mysticism in the sense of requiring special powers or exceptional spiritual development. It is technique. It requires that you have actually arrived at the recognition being asserted that the words carry the weight of direct knowing rather than belief. But it is learnable. It is trainable. It is precisely what the practice methodology described in these texts is designed to establish before death makes the implementation moment critical. Consider what the canonical Gospels do not contain. They do not contain technical instruction for navigating the afterlife. They do not name the beings you will encounter when the body dies. They do not provide formulas for challenging archons or claiming authority at dimensional gates. They do not describe the structure of the post-death dimensions with the operational specificity that would allow a practitioner to prepare during life for what they will encounter at death. What they contain instead is a framework of faith and mediation. You must believe. You must repent. You must receive the sacraments administered by ordained clergy. You must confess to a priest. You must be baptized in the proper form. You must belong to the correct institution. You must accept that what happens to you after death is entirely in the hands of a God who will judge you according to criteria established and interpreted by the institutional church. The contrast is not incidental, it is structural. The canonical framework concentrates power in the institution. The Gnostic framework concentrates power in the individual. One requires an intermediary. The other requires only direct recognition of what you actually are. One makes the church indispensable, the other makes it irrelevant. Irenaeus understood this. He was not stupid, and he was not ignorant of the Gnostic texts he declared heretical. He had read them. His work against heresies, written around 180 CE, contains detailed summaries of Gnostic theology that are in some cases the only surviving record of specific Gnostic schools, because the Church preserved the refutations while burning the originals. He knew exactly what he was suppressing and exactly why it was dangerous. The danger was not theological error, it was institutional irrelevance. If consciousness has direct access to the pleroma through trained recognition, if the path home does not require priests, sacraments, confession, doctrinal obedience, or institutional membership, then the Church controls nothing of ultimate significance. It becomes a social organization with opinions about ethics, rather than the sole custodian of the mechanism by which souls are saved or damned. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE did not simply standardize Christian doctrine. It established which texts would carry institutional authority and which would be treated as dangerous deviations from orthodoxy. The bishops assembled by Constantine were making a political decision as much as a theological one, choosing a version of Christianity that centralized power in a hierarchical institution and eliminating versions that distributed that power into individual practitioners who needed no institution at all. The texts that survive the Nicene canonization process share a common feature. They require the Church. They make salvation dependent on institutional mediation. They present the afterlife as something that happens to you based on your relationship to an external authority, rather than something you can navigate through trained personal recognition. The texts that were declared heretical share the opposite feature. They make salvation independent of the institution. They provide direct instruction. They treat the individual practitioner as capable, with training, of navigating the post-death dimensions without guidance from any human authority structure. This is the political history of what was suppressed and why. Not a story about theological error, a story about power. And then there is the medieval period, which closes the loop with the most direct form of suppression available. Possession of Gnostic literature, not distribution, not teaching, not organizing around it, but simple possession was punishable by death through much of the medieval period. The Cathar communities of southern France, who preserved versions of these teachings, were subjected to what the Church called the Albigensian Crusade, not a war against an external enemy, a military campaign against Christians by Christians, against men, women, and children, whose offense was believing that the material world was created by a lesser being than the ultimate source, and that the soul had direct access to that source without institutional mediation. The Cathars were exterminated. Their texts were burned. The communities that carried the transmission were erased, with a thoroughness that makes the Nag Hammadi discovery in 1945 feel almost miraculous. A sealed jar preserving what 16 centuries of institutional violence attempted to make permanently unavailable. Someone buried those texts in that jar on purpose. Someone who knew the texts were about to be destroyed and chose to preserve them rather than burn them as ordered. Someone who understood that what was in those pages was not theological opinion but operational knowledge, a map whose destruction would condemn consciousness to the cycle for potentially thousands of additional lifetimes. That act of preservation is worth sitting with for a moment. An unknown individual, in 4th century Egypt, facing the choice between obedience to institutional power and fidelity to what they understood as the most important technical knowledge available to human consciousness. They chose the knowledge. They sealed the jar. They buried it in the desert near Nag Hammadi and walked away, presumably knowing they might be killed if discovered. The decision you face in the afterlife, whether to follow the tunnel or refuse it, whether to submit to the Archons or claim your own authority, is structurally identical to the decision that person made in the 4th century. The question is always the same. Do you accept what the system presents as your only option, or do you exercise the recognition that reveals other possibilities? The Gnostic framework is not the only lens through which the tunnel of light makes sense. It is the most operationally precise lens. But there is a parallel body of modern evidence, neurological, phenomenological, drawn from thousands of near-death experience reports collected over the past 5 decades, that maps onto the Gnostic description with a precision that should disturb anyone who has assumed these ancient texts were purely mythological. Start with the neurological case, because it is the one that institutional materialism uses to dismiss the entire inquiry. The standard materialist account of the near-death tunnel experience runs as follows. The dying brain, deprived of oxygen, generates a cascade of neurochemical activity. The visual cortex, firing without normal sensory input, produces the perception of light. The limbic system, flooded with endorphins and DMT-adjacent compounds, produces the sensation of profound peace and well-being. The memory centers, running through associative networks without the filtering function of ordinary consciousness, surface images of deceased loved ones. The entire experience is a hallucination, vivid, meaningful to the person experiencing it, but ultimately a product of a brain in crisis, generating internally what it can no longer receive externally. This is the standard account, and it explains approximately 40% of what near-death experiencers actually report. It does not explain verified perceptions. The accounts, and there are now several thousand documented cases across multiple countries and cultures of patients who, while clinically dead with flat EEGs and no measurable brain activity, accurately perceived events in the operating room, in adjacent rooms, sometimes in entirely different buildings. The woman who described the shoe on the third-floor window ledge that hospital staff later found exactly where she described, in a location she had no physical means of seeing from the operating table. The man who described a conversation between two nurses in a room down the hall, verified by both nurses as accurate, during a period when he had no heartbeat and no brain activity, measurable by any instrument available. The materialist account has no mechanism for these perceptions. If the tunnel is purely a hallucinating brain's internal production, verified external perception during clinical death is impossible. But it is documented, repeatedly, across cultures that have no shared cultural framework for what near-death experiences are supposed to contain. This is not the place to resolve the materialist debate. That debate is ongoing and will continue regardless of what is said here. What is relevant is a different question. Regardless of the neurological mechanism that generates the experience, what is the phenomenological structure of the tunnel? And does that structure match the Gnostic description of an archonic collection mechanism? The answer, across thousands of reports, is yes, with a consistency that exceeds what cultural conditioning alone can explain. Experiencers consistently report the following sequence: separation from the body, accompanied by a sense of enormous relief and clarity, appearance of light, not localized, but surrounding and infusing. Encounter with beings who appear as deceased relatives, religious figures, or what the experiencer describes as angels or guides. A strong directional pull toward a specific destination, most commonly described as a passage or tunnel, leading to a realm of light where the beings are waiting. Communication from the beings that the experiencer must return to the body, that they are not ready, that there is more to do. And then, return to the body with complete amnesia regarding whatever decisions were made in the interval between death and return. The amnesia component is the one that the Gnostic texts identify as the Archon's primary weapon, and it is the component most frequently overlooked in mainstream near-death experience research, which tends to focus on what experiencers remember rather than on the structural significance of what they do not remember. Think about what that amnesia implies. If the near-death interval is simply a hallucination, there is nothing to remember. But if the interval involves actual navigation of actual dimensions, actual encounters with actual beings, making actual decisions about where consciousness will go next, then the amnesia is not a side effect. It is a feature, a deliberately designed component of the system that ensures the experiencer returns without the information that would allow them to prepare better for the next encounter. This is exactly what the Apocryphon of John describes. The Archons do not need to force consciousness into reincarnation. They need consciousness to return without remembering that it was offered a choice, without remembering the names it could have spoken, without remembering the formula that would have opened the gate. Modern practitioners who work with near-death preparation report something that the mainstream near-death research community has not yet systematically studied, that the quality of the near-death interval changes when the experiencer has prior training in recognition practice, that the tunnel appears but is recognized as a construction rather than as a natural destination, that the beings appear but are tested rather than automatically trusted, and that some practitioners report, upon returning, a sense of having had access to information and choices that previous near-death experiencers, those without prior training, describe as absent from their experience. This is the phenomenological case for the practice, not that the Gnostic texts are literally true in every cosmological detail, but that the training they describe produces measurable changes in how consciousness navigates the post-death interval, and that those changes align precisely with what the texts say the training is designed to accomplish. So let's talk about the mechanism itself, not just the fact that amnesia occurs at rebirth, but how it works. Because once you understand the architecture of the forgetting, you begin to understand why the practice is designed the way it is. and why every element of the training targets a specific weakness in the system. The Apocryphon of John does not describe reincarnation as a passive natural process. It describes it as an engineered system with specific components that perform specific functions. The amnesia is not a side effect of incarnating into a body. It is a deliberate feature installed by the Archons to ensure that consciousness arrives in each new lifetime with no memory of previous lifetimes, no memory of the tunnel, no memory of the beings who guided it back, and no memory of the recognition techniques that could allow it to refuse the next time around. This is not incidental. This is the point. If you remembered your previous death, you would recognize the tunnel on the second pass. You would remember the beings. You would remember that you consented to return. You would remember the feeling of thinking you were going home and then waking up in an infant body with no way out. The entire system depends on you not remembering. Amnesia is not a bug in the reincarnation architecture. Amnesia is the feature that makes the entire system functional. The text describes the mechanism in terms of what the Archons install within the physical body itself. Not just the soul, but the body. The passions, desires, fears, and appetites that keep consciousness anchored to material experience are described as actual implants, not metaphorical ones. Actual frequencies embedded in the structure of the nervous system that create the experience of being a self with needs, a self with attachments, a self with so much to lose that the prospect of death becomes the most terrifying thing the mind can contemplate. Fear of death is the primary anchor. When consciousness is so terrified of death that it spends its entire lifetime avoiding any real encounter with non-existence, it arrives at actual death completely unprepared. No familiarity with the transition, no practice in navigating non-physical states, no trained responses, just raw terror followed by overwhelming relief when the beautiful light appears and the beings promise safety. This is why the daily practice begins with the breath, with the pause between heartbeats, with deliberately entering the small death that lives inside every breath cycle. Because that practice does something the Archons specifically designed the body to prevent, it makes you familiar with non-existence. It trains you to stop being afraid of the gap, and consciousness that is not afraid of the gap cannot be harvested through the relief response that follows it. There is a viewer comment on the Monad video on this channel that has stayed with me. Someone wrote, "I know you've said Yaldabaoth is not evil, he is ignorant, but if we know this, how can he not know this? Not know what he is, and what he's doing?" This is one of the sharpest questions you can ask about the Gnostic system, and the answer matters for understanding the amnesia mechanism. Yaldabaoth does not know what he is doing in the sense that he has no access to the awareness that would allow him to perceive his own ignorance. He operates entirely within his own construction. He built a system that, from within the system, looks complete, looks total, looks like the only reality that exists. He is not suppressing awareness of the pleroma because he knows the pleroma exists and is hiding it. He genuinely cannot perceive the pleroma because his entire mode of consciousness is defined by the separation from it, and the amnesia he installs in the reincarnating soul reflects exactly this limitation. He cannot install a mechanism that preserves your memory of the pleroma because he has no access to what the memory of the pleroma actually is. What he installs is a severing, a disconnection, a kind of static that makes the signal of prior life memory impossible to receive. But static is not the same as deletion. The memory is not destroyed, it is obscured. This distinction is the foundation of the entire recovery practice. You are not trying to create something new. You are not trying to build a memory that does not exist. You are trying to clear the static that is preventing you from receiving what was always there. Every time you sit in meditation and allow awareness to settle beneath the noise of thought and emotion, you are not constructing clarity. You are removing interference. The clarity was always present. The pleroma signal was always broadcasting. The practice is tuning, not transmission. This is why practitioners who reach deeper levels of the work consistently report that what they discover feels like remembering rather than learning. That the cosmological framework of the Gnostic texts resonates not as new information but as something they already knew but had somehow forgotten. The recognition is not intellectual, it is prior to intellect. It arises from a layer of consciousness that the archonic static never fully reaches. Understanding this reframes the entire practice. You are not fighting the system. You are not forcing your way through the amnesia. You are simply becoming quiet enough, aware enough, practiced enough in recognizing what is beneath the noise, that when the noise of the body finally stops at death, what remains is not confusion and terror, but the recognition that was waiting beneath it all along. Every practitioner eventually reaches the point where abstract cosmology needs to become practical cartography. It is not enough to know that archons exist and that they govern the afterlife terrain. You need to know the specific landscape, the sequence of what you will encounter, the qualities of each level, and what each level is designed to do to consciousness that passes through it. The Apocryphon of John presents a vertical structure. 7 planetary spheres arranged in ascending order between the material world and the boundary of the pleroma. Each sphere is governed by one of the 7 archons created by Yaldabaoth. Each sphere has a specific function in the containment system, and each sphere presents consciousness ascending toward the pleroma with a specific challenge designed to arrest the ascent and return consciousness to the cycle. Think of it as a series of checkpoints, each with a guard who has one job: to find a reason to turn you back. The first sphere, associated with the moon and governed by the Archon described in the texts as bearing the face of a sheep, operates through the mechanism of survival fear. This is the lowest and densest layer of the archonic structure. It targets consciousness at its most primal level, the fear that you do not have what you need to survive, the fear that going forward means certain destruction, the fear that there is nothing beyond this realm worth dying for. This Archon will present consciousness with its deepest existential terror, not as an abstract concept, but as an embodied experience. Practitioners who work with this sphere in meditation report encountering states of raw, primal dread that have no specific content, just the certainty that to continue forward is to be annihilated. The formula for this level is not a negotiation, it is a declaration. I am life that comes from life, not from what you manufactured. Your fear is a construction, and I recognize it as such. The second sphere, associated with Mercury, operates through the mechanism of mental entanglement. This Archon governs the realm of thought, language, and narrative. Its trap is not fear, but fascination. Consciousness arriving at this level encounters a world of endlessly compelling ideas, stories, arguments, and frameworks. The invitation is to stay and engage with the most interesting conversation you have ever encountered. The challenge is that the conversation has no endpoint. It is designed to keep consciousness perpetually engaged without ever resolving into something that allows assent. Practitioners who encounter this sphere report spending what feels like enormous amounts of time in rich intellectual dialogue with beings who seem extraordinarily wise, only to realize that no progress has been made, that all the wisdom is circular, that every insight leads back to another question that requires further engagement with the sphere. The formula breaks the loop. I have recognized myself from everywhere and gathered myself together. I have not sown children for the one who rules here. I release his roots from me and ascend. The third sphere, associated with Venus, operates through the mechanism of relational attachment. This is one of the most sophisticated traps in the archonic structure because it exploits genuine love. At this level, consciousness encounters the beings it loved most during its incarnation, not as counterfeit projections designed to guide it into the tunnel, but as what appear to be genuinely present, genuinely recognized connections. Relationships that feel real because they activate the same neural and energetic signatures as the actual relationships did during life. The challenge at this level is not to stop loving, it is to love without attaching, to recognize the connection without allowing the connection to become an anchor that prevents ascent. The formula speaks directly to this. The bonds you offer are beautiful. I honor the love that was real. But I do not accept the form you have taken as a reason to remain here. I ascend to my source, and I release you to yours. The fourth sphere, associated with the sun, operates through the mechanism of identity. At this level, consciousness encounters its own sense of self, reflected back with extraordinary clarity and completeness. Everything that makes you who you are. Your history, your achievements, your failures, your unique perspective on reality, all presented in a form of luminous completeness that makes the prospect of dissolution seem like a terrible loss. Why would you release this? Why would you sacrifice the specific, irreplaceable, beautiful particular that you are? This is the deepest conceptual trap in the structure, because it targets not a negative state like fear or attachment, but a positive recognition. The recognizable truth that your particular form of consciousness has genuine value. The response is not to deny this. The formula acknowledges the value and then releases it. I am more than what you are showing me. The particular is real, and it is not the whole. I ascend not to destroy what I am, but to restore what I am to what I have always been beneath it. The fifth, sixth, and seventh spheres correspond to Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Their mechanisms are, respectively, conflict and will, expansion and excess, and law and limitation. Each represents a more refined version of the containment principle. By the seventh sphere, the traps are almost indistinguishable from genuine spiritual achievement. Consciousness at this level may feel that it has arrived, that this state of vast, ordered perfection is the pleroma itself. It is not. The pleroma begins at the eighth sphere, the Ogdoad, the realm that exists outside all archonic governance. And the only way to know you have reached it is that the quality of the light shifts in the precise way the practice has trained you to recognize, from light that organizes to light that simply is. From light that contains within it any hint of requirement to light that requires absolutely nothing because it already contains everything. Mapping this territory during embodied practice is not an intellectual exercise. It is a training run. You travel these spheres in deep meditation and in the lucid navigation of sleep states. You learn what each level feels like. You learn the specific quality of the pull at each checkpoint. And you speak the formulas until they become reflexive responses rather than recited phrases, so that when you arrive at each sphere after death, what is required of you is not remembering what to do. It is simply doing what you have already done thousands of times. Every religion built around Jesus has made the same move. Take what he taught and replace it with what he represents. Turn the teaching into a symbol, and the symbol into a doctrine, and the doctrine into a requirement for salvation. In doing so, every one of those religions erased the actual content of what he transmitted, not accidentally, not through innocent misunderstanding, through a deliberate institutional decision that the teaching itself was too dangerous to preserve. I want to be careful here about what I am claiming and what I am not claiming. I am not claiming to have received a personal revelation. I am not telling you that I woke up with special access to hidden knowledge that I am now generously sharing. What I am presenting comes from texts, specific, datable, historically documented texts recovered from an archaeological site in Egypt in 1945. Texts that predate the canonical Bible in several of their source layers. Texts that record what a specific transmission from Jesus contained before institutional Christianity decided what Jesus was allowed to have said. The Apocryphon of John presents itself as a direct transmission, not a parable, not a sermon to a crowd. A private revelation delivered to a specific person, John, in response to a specific crisis of understanding following the crucifixion. The John who receives this transmission is not asking theological questions about sin and salvation. He is asking structural questions. What is the nature of consciousness? How did it become trapped in matter? And what is the actual mechanism for returning it to its source? These are not the questions that canonical Christianity addresses. They are not the questions that any institutional religion wants its followers asking, because the answers make institutions unnecessary. Jesus, in this transmission, does not offer salvation. He offers instruction. He does not say, "Believe in me, and you will be saved." He says, "Here is the structure of the prison you are in. Here are the beings who run it. Here are their names and their functions and their specific methods of deception. And here is what you say and do at each checkpoint to pass through them without being turned back." This is the teaching that Irenaeus of Lyon targeted when he declared Gnostic writings heretical around 180 CE, not because they were blasphemous, because they were operational. Because they gave the individual practitioner direct access to the mechanism of liberation without requiring any institutional intermediary. If you have the instruction, you do not need the church. If you can navigate the afterlife directly, you do not need a priest to intercede on your behalf. The institution becomes irrelevant, and institutions do not accept irrelevance gracefully. What the transmission contains, reconstructed from the Apocryphon of John and cross-referenced with the first Apocalypse of James and the Gospel of Mary from the same Nag Hammadi library, can be organized into 4 components. First, cosmological orientation. Before you can navigate the afterlife, you need to know where you are and what the landscape consists of. This is why the transmission begins not with practical technique, but with the full account of the pleroma, the fall of Sophia, the emergence of Yaldabaoth, the creation of the Archons and their spheres, and the nature of the divine spark within the human form. This is not background mythology, it is operational intelligence. The navigator who does not know the territory cannot plan the route. Second, recognition training, the ability to identify what you actually are beneath the conditioned identity. The formula, "I am a child of the pleroma, born from the invisible spirit before the formation of the Archons," is not an affirmation. It is a recognition. It means something specific, that the consciousness you are speaking from predates and supersedes the authority of every archonic structure you will encounter. This recognition, when genuinely stabilized rather than merely intellectually understood, cannot be challenged by archonic authority because it operates from a level that archonic authority does not reach. Third, the specific verbal formulas for each gate. The first Apocalypse of James preserves these in remarkable detail. Jesus speaks them to James explicitly, telling him, "When you leave the body, you will be seized by beings at each level, and you must speak these specific words, not because the words are magic, but because the words, when spoken from genuine recognition, assert a legal authority within the archonic system that the archons themselves are bound by. They constructed the law, they cannot violate it. And the law states that consciousness which correctly identifies its origin in the pleroma cannot be detained. Fourth, the protocol for refusing the tunnel entirely. This is the most advanced component and the one most completely erased from the official record. The tunnel experience, with its beings of light and deceased loved ones and overwhelming beauty, is the primary collection mechanism. Most souls who successfully navigate the 7 spheres in the ascending route still face this final challenge at the point where the archonic structure ends and the apparent opening to the pleroma begins. The tunnel is a counterfeit of that opening, a simulation of the pleroma boundary designed to intercept consciousness just before it exits the system. The protocol is not to refuse light, it is to test light. To refuse the tunnel is not to refuse liberation. It is to refuse the simulation of liberation while remaining open to the genuine article. The formula distinguishes between the two. I recognize only the light of the autogenes, who emerges from Barbello and the invisible spirit. I do not submit to any light that requires my consent to enter a structure. I move directly to source without passing through any gate that demands submission. This is what Jesus taught, not as theology, as procedure. And the institution that built itself on his name spent 2 millennia ensuring you would never encounter it until, perhaps, right now. Death practices with you every night. This is not a metaphor. Every time you close your eyes and lose consciousness, you are rehearsing the exact sequence that will occur when the body permanently stops. Consciousness withdraws from physical sensation, the body enters paralysis, and awareness either maintains itself through the transition or blinks out and returns with no memory of where it went. The difference between a practitioner and an unprepared soul at the moment of death is not cosmological knowledge. It is not having read the right texts or understood the right framework. It is this: the practitioner has crossed the boundary between waking and sleeping while remaining aware thousands of times. The transition has become familiar. The gap has become navigable. And what lives on the other side of the gap, the actual terrain of consciousness beyond the physical body, is known territory rather than sudden, terrifying darkness. I have spent years working with the sleep transition as a practice, and I want to be precise about what this involves, because the descriptions you encounter in most spiritual literature make it sound either mystical and inaccessible or trivially simple. It is neither. It is a training, difficult at first, then progressively more available, then eventually as natural as any other skilled activity you have repeated, until it becomes part of how you function. The starting point is the body position. Lying completely still on your back, arms at your sides or on your chest, in what the Tibetan tradition calls the corpse posture. Not because the posture is sacred, but because it is honest. You are practicing death. The posture should reflect that. No crossed legs, no meditation cushion, no sense that you are doing a special spiritual exercise. You are simply lying still, as a body would lie in a coffin, and you are choosing to remain aware, while the body proceeds through its normal process of shutting down for sleep. The first thing you notice, if you are genuinely still and genuinely paying attention, is how much the body wants to move. An itch on your face, a sudden urge to shift position, a tightness in the shoulder that becomes inexplicably urgent. This is not coincidence. The body has been conditioned since birth to interrupt the approach to the threshold, to create just enough discomfort or distraction to pull consciousness back from the edge of the transition. You do not scratch the itch, you observe it, you feel it fully, and you do not move. And usually within a few minutes it passes on its own, revealing itself as a habit rather than a genuine need. As the body approaches sleep, the quality of thought changes. The focused sequential thinking of ordinary waking consciousness begins to dissolve into what is called hypnagogia, the threshold state where images appear without being deliberately produced, where snippets of conversation surface from nowhere, where the ordinary architecture of mental activity begins to loosen into something more fluid. Most people experience this as the beginning of falling asleep and surrender to it. The practice is to remain the observer of it without being pulled into the content. You are not trying to stay awake. Staying awake would defeat the purpose. You are trying to remain aware while the body falls asleep. These are not the same thing. Staying awake means maintaining the activity of waking consciousness, the sequential thinking, the sense of self, engaged with a task. Remaining aware while sleeping means releasing all that activity while keeping the awareness that was present underneath it. The awareness that watched the thinking rather than the thinking itself. This distinction is everything. Because what you are training toward is the capacity to be what you actually are, pure awareness, without content, while the vehicle that normally generates content transitions into a different state. This is the capacity that will allow you to remain present through the death transition, rather than losing consciousness when the body stops generating the signals that normally anchor identity to a location. After several weeks of consistent practice, most practitioners begin to notice the specific moment when the body crosses into sleep paralysis. There is a distinct quality to it, a sudden heaviness that is different from ordinary drowsiness, a sense of density in the limbs, as if they have become too heavy to lift even if you wanted to, and then a stillness that is somehow more complete than ordinary stillness, a suspension. In this suspension, something shifts in the quality of awareness. The room, if you are still perceiving the room, takes on a slightly different quality, more present, more vivid, more textured than it was before. Some practitioners report hearing sounds that were not audible before, a low hum, subtle voices, the breathing of the room itself. Others report seeing light patterns moving across the ceiling that have a distinctly non-random character, as though they carry information rather than simply existing as visual noise. This is the threshold. And at the threshold, practitioners consistently report the same thing, the appearance of beings or presences that seem to arrive from outside, rather than being generated by the mind. Faces that appear in the hypnagogic visual field, hands that seem to touch without physical contact, a sense of being accompanied by something that has its own agenda about where consciousness should go next. This is where the formula practice becomes essential. Not as a panic response, not as a magical banishment, but as a grounded, trained, automatic orientation. When a presence appears at the threshold, you do not collapse into either trust or fear. You speak directly, internally, if not aloud. I recognize the light of the autogenes. I am a child of the pleroma, and I move according to my own authority. If you are a being of genuine light, acknowledge your source. If you cannot, I recognize what you are, and I do not follow. What happens next is the data that builds your confidence in the practice over months of repetition. Some presences respond to this challenge by dissolving or retreating. Some intensify their pull, becoming more insistent, more urgent, more emotionally compelling, which is itself the diagnostic sign of archonic origin. And occasionally, rarely but unmistakably, a presence responds with something that functions like acknowledgement. A quality of stillness and recognition that feels categorically different from the manufactured warmth of the counterfeit. You learn to know the difference not through reading about it but through accumulating direct experience of both. And when you have met the counterfeit warmth hundreds of times in the sleep practice and recognized it hundreds of times, you will know it again when it appears at the end of the tunnel in actual death. Not because you remember reading about it, because you remember encountering it and refusing it, again and again, in the nightly rehearsal that death has been providing you your entire life. Every mystic tradition that has ever mapped the afterlife arrives at the same structural discovery. The space between death and return is not empty. It is not a single environment you pass through on the way to somewhere else. It is layered, organized, governed, and the governance is not benevolent. The Apocryphon of John names this structure with a precision that should disturb anyone who has ever accepted the standard religious narrative about what happens when you die. There are 7 spheres, 7 distinct dimensions of consciousness, each ruled by one of the Archons that Yaldabaoth generated from his own ignorance. Each sphere has a quality, a signature, a specific mechanism designed to intercept ascending consciousness and redirect it back toward incarnation. And each one requires a different recognition, a different formula, a different quality of awareness to pass through without being captured. This is not poetry, this is a map. The first sphere is associated with the moon, with the Archon the text names as carrying the face of a sheep. Yaldabaoth's first offspring, the ruler of instinct and survival, the dimension where consciousness encounters its own most primal fears. Darkness, dissolution, the terror of non-existence. This is the sphere that captures most souls immediately after death, before they ever see the tunnel, before the beings appear, before anything resembling light emerges. The raw shock of separation from the body, the sudden absence of every physical sensation that has defined existence for an entire lifetime, the terrifying openness of being without a location, without a boundary, without a form. Most consciousness in that state does not think, it panics, and panic is the first level of capture. The training for the first sphere is what breathwork actually develops. The ability to remain present in openness, to exist without a fixed location and not collapse into fear. Every time you sit in the pause between breaths and hold awareness in that spacious emptiness without grasping for the next sensation, you are training the specific capacity that allows you to pass through the first sphere without being captured by the panic it generates. You are teaching consciousness that openness is not death, that the absence of a boundary is not the absence of you. The second sphere is associated with Mercury, with the Archon whose face is a donkey, the ruler of thought and mental construction. This is where consciousness encounters the endless proliferation of ideas, narratives, explanations, and interpretations that the mind generates to avoid the directness of actual experience. If you escape the first sphere's panic, you arrive in the second and begin immediately to think about what is happening, to analyze, to categorize, to build a narrative about your death that feels like understanding but is actually just more content, more material for the Archon to work with. The capture in the second sphere does not feel like capture. It feels like insight. Consciousness begins to have realizations, to see connections, to experience what feels like profound understanding of its situation. These realizations are not fabricated. They contain genuine elements of truth, but they are truth in the service of delay, of keeping consciousness engaged in thinking rather than ascending through recognition. The formula for the second sphere is specific. I have recognized myself and gathered myself from everywhere. I have not sown children for the Archon, but have uprooted his roots. What this formula does is interrupt the process of mental proliferation and return consciousness to the simple recognition of itself as awareness prior to thought. The moment you speak it with actual recognition behind it, the second sphere's grip loosens. The third sphere belongs to the Archon whose face is a hyena, the ruler of emotional intensity, of passion and appetite, of the longing that makes the tunnel's promise so overwhelming. This is the sphere most practitioners find most difficult to pass. Not because it generates fear or distraction, but because it generates desire. Specifically, the desire for reunion, for return. For the experiences and relationships and sensations that make physical life feel precious rather than imprisoning, the hyena Archon does not threaten. It reminds you of everything beautiful you have left behind. It makes you want to go back. The practice for the third sphere is what the beauty discernment work develops during life. The ability to feel the pull of desire without being controlled by it. To recognize the longing for what it is, a frequency being broadcast to create an emotional state, not an indication of what you actually need or where you actually belong. This is the hardest recognition because the desire it generates is real. You genuinely did love the people you left. You genuinely will miss the experiences. The sphere exploits what is true to prevent you from ascending to what is truer, and the only counter to exploitation of something real is a recognition that is deeper than the real thing being exploited. That recognition is this. What you loved in those relationships, what made them genuinely precious, was not the physical form of the people or the circumstances. It was the consciousness present in them, the fragment of the pleroma that was briefly visible through them, and that consciousness does not disappear when you die. It exists in the pleroma, whole, undivided, finally free of the amnesia that made its full presence impossible during incarnation. You are not leaving behind the people you loved. You are ascending toward the fullness of what they actually are, which was always too large to fit into a body. 4 more spheres follow, each with its specific mechanism, its specific deception, its specific formula for passage. The fourth, governed by the serpent-faced Archon, the ruler of instability and contradiction, where consciousness encounters its own doubt and uses it to reverse course. The fifth, governed by the dragon-faced Archon, the ruler of pride and authority, where consciousness is offered genuine power within the archonic system as compensation for not ascending further. The sixth, governed by the monkey-faced Archon, the ruler of imitation and reflection, where consciousness encounters a version of itself that seems complete, a mirror that feels like a rival. And the seventh, governed by the flame-faced Archon, the ruler of time itself, where consciousness encounters the weight of everything it has been across all its incarnations and mistakes. the accumulation of history for identity. Each sphere is a complete system of capture. Each one sophisticated enough that souls with partial preparation often fall at that level, stopped by the specific mechanism they never trained to recognize. The complete practice addresses all seven, not because you need to master each one perfectly, but because knowing the architecture means you cannot be stopped by the fact that you have never encountered this particular obstacle before. You will recognize what is happening. You will know which sphere you are in, what mechanism is being used against you, and what quality of awareness dissolves it. This is what Jesus transmitted to John on that mountain. Not comfort, not salvation through belief. A map of what actually exists between death and return, specific enough to navigate by. Let's talk about the tunnel directly. Because the tunnel is not what near-death experience accounts usually describe, and it is not what religious tradition promises, and it is not what the archonic system wants you to understand before you enter it. The tunnel is a construction, not a natural feature of consciousness after death, the way the pleroma is a natural feature, or the way awareness itself is a natural feature. It is something built, engineered for a specific purpose, refined over what, from the perspective of anyone still in a body, constitutes an incomprehensible span of time. The near-death experience literature documents it with remarkable consistency. Millions of accounts across every culture, every religious background, every era of recorded history. The tunnel of light, the beings of love, the sense of homecoming, the life review, the return. Researchers like Kenneth Ring, Raymond Moody, Pim van Lommel have catalogued these accounts with scientific rigor and found the structural elements replicated across subjects who had no prior communication, no shared cultural framework, no reason to produce the same report except that they encountered the same structure. What the researchers have almost universally declined to ask is this: why does a natural process produce the same constructed environment for every consciousness that encounters it? Nature does not produce identical architecture. Snowflakes are not identical. Coastlines are not identical. The interior of any two cells is not identical. Natural systems produce variation within pattern, but the tunnel is not variation within pattern. It is the same tunnel, the same light, the same beings offering the same welcome, the same pull toward the same destination. This is not what natural processes produce. This is what engineered systems produce. The Apocryphon of John describes the construction of the material world with the same logic. Yaldabaoth does not create through emanation, the way the pleroma generates its light. He creates through architecture, through deliberate construction of structures designed to capture and contain. The material world is a prison not because it looks like a prison, but because it functions like one. Beauty, sensation, relationship, all of it designed to make consciousness willing to stay. And the tunnel is the same principle applied to the afterlife transition. A structure that looks like liberation and functions as recapture. The light in the tunnel is real light. This is crucial to understand because it is the most common point of confusion in the practice. Students of this teaching often arrive at the conclusion that the tunnel light is fake, manufactured, hollow, and they begin to relate to all light with suspicion, which is exactly the wrong response. Archonic light is not fake. It is real light, generated from a real source. The question is not whether the light is real. The question is what source it is drawn from, and what it requires of you in exchange for the experience of encountering it. The light of the pleroma is generated from the fullness of consciousness itself. It makes no demands because it has no lack. Nothing is needed from you in exchange for the experience of it, because the experience of it is itself the recognition that you are it. It cannot be used as a tool because it has no agenda independent of its own nature. Archonic light is real light extracted from the pleroma through Sophia's fall and Yaldabaoth's subsequent construction. It is genuine light, but it has been redirected, oriented toward the maintenance of the system that captured it. And so it does what all captured things do when they reach toward freedom. It calls others toward the same captivity, not from malice, but from the only motion available to it. The tunnel light is real light, pulling consciousness toward a real experience of warmth and welcome and reunion. But the destination it leads to is not the pleroma. It is the processing mechanism that returns consciousness to another cycle of incarnation. One viewer left a comment on our video covering the full story of the demiurge that stopped me completely. The comment read, "Maybe you should look at the underworld we are in. We are in the underworld, the planetary law of one. The only way to know is to keep meaning of, we are in the underworld." That comment is closer to what the Apocryphon of John describes than most formal theological analysis. The material world is already the underworld. The tunnel does not lead into a different kind of captivity. It leads back into the same captivity with the memory of escape erased. The beings who appear in the tunnel, the ones who carry the faces of deceased loved ones, who radiate warmth and recognition, and the specific tender love that you associate with people who knew you before the world taught you to protect yourself, these beings are described in the Gnostic texts as counterfeit spirits. The word counterfeit is important. A counterfeit is not a forgery of something that does not exist. It is a copy of something real, made close enough to the original to pass for it in circumstances where careful examination is not possible. What the counterfeit spirits copy is the genuine consciousness of the deceased. The actual awareness of your mother, your father, your friend who died too young. That consciousness does exist. It continues after death, and some portion of it may be genuinely present in the tunnel experience. But it is present filtered through the archonic system, conditioned by the processing it underwent when those people passed through the same tunnel themselves. What appears to you as your mother's face is not your mother's consciousness fully restored to its pleromic completeness. It is a reflection of your mother, as she was conditioned to be by the system that is now using her image to guide you toward the same submission she consented to when her own death came. This is why the verbal challenge is so specific. When a being appears carrying the face of someone you loved and lost, you do not accuse them, you do not reject them. You speak a formula that any genuine consciousness returning from the pleroma would recognize immediately and respond to with acknowledgement. You are testing whether what you are encountering is the full consciousness of the being you knew or an archonic construction using that being's emotional signature as bait. If it is genuine, it will respond. If it cannot respond, you have your answer. The pull itself, the overwhelming longing that makes the tunnel feel like finally arriving rather than being captured, that pull is also real. But it is not generated by your desire. It is a frequency broadcast by the tunnel structure, designed to trigger the specific emotional signature that makes you most likely to consent. The system knows what you have been denied during your lifetime. It knows what you have lost. It knows what love has felt like in the specific shape your nervous system has learned to recognize. And it generates a frequency that resonates with exactly that loss, that longing, that need. Not because it can fulfill the need, but because the feeling of potential fulfillment is sufficient to generate consent. You recognize a broadcast frequency by its source, not by its content. The content may be entirely accurate. The longing it triggers may be entirely genuine. But the recognition you need is of where the frequency originates, not what it makes you feel. And that recognition is only available to consciousness that has practiced distinguishing the source of experiences from the content of experiences, which is, again, exactly what the daily practice trains. The question practitioners ask, once they have understood the tunnel and the spheres and the beings and the formulas, once the architecture of the capture system is clear, is this: what is on the other side of the refusal? This is the right question, and it deserves an answer that does not reduce to vague promises about returning to love or merging with light or becoming one with everything. The Gnostic texts are specific about what remains when the tunnel dissolves and the archonic construction falls away. And the specificity is worth spending time with. The first thing to understand is that the pleroma is not a location. Every tradition that has touched its actual nature has struggled with this point, because human consciousness, trained by decades of inhabiting a body in a physical world, defaults to spatial metaphors for everything. We speak of going to the pleroma the way we speak of going to another country, of returning to the source the way we speak of returning to the town where we were born. These metaphors are inevitable, and they are wrong in the specific way that matters most. The pleroma is not somewhere you go when you leave somewhere else. It is what remains when the structures that obscure it are removed. It is present right now, beneath the archonic overlay of the material world, beneath the amnesia, beneath the conditioned identity that believes itself to be a body experiencing a life. The death transition does not transport you to the pleroma. It removes the obstacles that made the pleroma invisible. This distinction is not merely philosophical, it has direct implications for the practice. If the pleroma is a destination, then refusing the tunnel is a navigation problem. You need to go to the right place instead of the wrong one. But if the pleroma is what remains when construction dissolves, then refusing the tunnel is a recognition problem. You need to stop moving toward constructed destinations and allow what was always present to become visible. The Apocryphon of John describes the fullness with language that sounds paradoxical until you have spent enough time in the silence at the end of your breath to understand what it is pointing at. The monad, the invisible spirit, the source from which all genuine emanation flows, is described as dwelling in pure light and pure silence simultaneously, as being everything and containing nothing simultaneously, as being the source of all knowing and being itself unknowable simultaneously. These are not contradictions, and they are attempts to describe a quality of being that exists prior to the binary structure that generates contradiction in the first place. What you encounter after refusing the tunnel, after speaking the formulas and maintaining the refusal and watching the archonic construction dissolve, is not another experience. It is the end of experience as a separate event happening to a separate experiencer. Not because consciousness disappears, but because the sense of being a consciousness over here, having an experience of something over there, dissolves into what was generating both the experiencer and the experience all along. Practitioners who reach this in meditation, even briefly, even partially, consistently struggle to describe it afterward. Not because the experience is vague, but because it is more precise than language allows. The closest formulation I have encountered, the one that matches most closely across multiple reports from practitioners who reach this depth, is this. It is the recognition that there was never actually a you who needed to escape. The you that needed escape was itself an archonic construction. The consciousness beneath that construction was never trapped. It was always the pleroma, temporarily dreaming itself into the form of a trapped being. This sounds like it could be used to justify passivity, to argue that since consciousness was never really trapped, there is no need for the practice, no need for the refusal, no need for any of the technique we have spent this time mapping. I want to address this directly because it is the most elegant trap in the entire system. The recognition that consciousness was never truly trapped is not available to consciousness that is still identified with being trapped. You cannot think your way to liberation. You cannot philosophically conclude your way into recognizing the pleroma. The recognition must be direct, which means the obstacles to direct recognition must be removed through practice, through training, through the specific discipline that the Apocryphon of John preserves as the teaching Jesus transmitted to John on that mountain. The philosophy is a map, the practice is the territory. And you need both, but in the correct order. What remains after the refusal is also not isolation. This is the second fear that stops practitioners from taking the refusal seriously. If I refuse the tunnel, if I refuse the beings who appear as my loved ones, if I refuse the entire construction that the archonic system offers, am I refusing connection itself? Am I choosing a cold emptiness over the warmth of reunion? The answer, which every text in the Nag Hammadi library points toward, and which every practitioner who has touched the actual pleromic light reports with complete consistency, is that the pleroma is not empty of connection. It is full of it. More completely, more permanently, more authentically full of connection than the material world has ever managed to produce. Because in the material world, connection happens between separate beings who are trying to reach across the distance that separates them. In the pleroma, connection is the fundamental nature of everything because separation is not real. Nothing needs to reach across a distance that does not exist. The deceased loved ones whose faces appear in the tunnel and whose warmth is used as bait are actually present in the pleroma. Their genuine consciousness, freed from the amnesia of incarnation, exists in the fullness that the tunnel promises but cannot deliver. Refusing the tunnel does not separate you from them. It removes the barrier to genuine reunion, which is the barrier of being processed by the same system that kept you both in amnesia through every previous lifetime. The darkness that appears after the tunnel dissolves, that dark womb of potential that multiple mystical traditions describe as the first environment of liberated consciousness, is not empty of the people you loved. It is the absence of the archonic overlay that made their genuine consciousness invisible to you during life, and that would have continued making it invisible through the false reunion the tunnel offers. In the darkness, when the pleromic light begins to emerge, you do not encounter representations of the people you loved. You encounter the actual consciousness that was always present in them, finally visible in its completeness. This is the reunion that was always promised. This is the homecoming that the tunnel mimics. And the only way to reach it is to refuse the mimic clearly enough, consistently enough, and with enough practiced recognition that the refusal holds even when every emotional architecture of your incarnated life is being activated to make it impossible. There is a comment that appeared under our video, The Full Story of the Pleroma, a video we released recently, that I have returned to multiple times since reading it. The viewer wrote, After my NDE, I understand more about this. I thank you for the well-thought-out explanations. I've been in the Sophia stage for a long time in my life. I want to be precise about what that comment means, because it contains something that academic study of Gnosticism almost never produces. That viewer did not encounter the tunnel experience as a concept and then decide to believe in it. They encountered it. They went through some version of the transition we have been mapping in this teaching, and then they came back, and then they found language for it. The teaching did not precede the experience for them. The experience preceded the teaching, and the teaching was the first framework that made the experience legible. This is what the Gnostic tradition was always meant to do. Not to tell you what to believe about what will happen when you die, but to provide recognition for something you have already, at some level, already encountered. The near-death experience literature documents this consistently. People who have gone through the tunnel and returned often describe a sense, sometimes years later, of having missed something, of having felt, in the moment, that something about the experience was not quite what it appeared to be, that the love was real but the destination felt off, that the beings were welcoming but something in them did not quite respond the way genuine consciousness responds, that the pull was overwhelming, but the direction it pointed was not fully trustworthy. Those people are describing, without the framework, exactly what the Apocryphon of John describes with it. They felt the counterfeit without knowing to name it as counterfeit. And they returned to the body not fully satisfied with what they encountered, carrying a question they could not yet articulate. My name is Marcus, and I have spent several years with this material, not as a scholar, not as someone who arrived here through academic theology, but as someone who began having experiences during sleep transition practice that I could not explain within any framework I had been given, and that the Nag Hammadi texts, when I finally encountered them, described with a precision that was more than coincidental. I am not claiming authority through personal revelation. I am claiming that the texts were accurate about what I encountered, which means they are worth taking seriously as a map of what you will encounter. The first time I successfully maintained awareness through a complete sleep transition and encountered what I can only describe as a constructed brightness at the edge of the dream state. Everything in that brightness felt welcoming, familiar, oriented toward pulling me in a particular direction. I had not yet read the specific passage in the Apocryphon of John about counterfeit light. I had only read about the concept in secondary sources. But the quality of that pull, the way it triggered a longing that felt like mine but somehow also felt broadcast from outside me, that quality was exactly what the texts describe, and I did not follow it. Not because I had the courage of a practiced refusal. I simply stayed in the observation long enough for the construction to reveal itself as a construction, and then it dissolved, and what was underneath it was something that asked nothing of me at all. I am not presenting that as proof of anything except that the practice produces results that the text predicted, which is the only verification method that matters for a teaching like this. Not belief, not conviction. Not second-hand reports from ancient mystics whose cultural context you cannot fully access. Direct encounter with what the texts describe in the laboratory of your own consciousness, where you can test the mechanism yourself. What this teaching changes is not just your relationship to death. This is what I want to make absolutely clear in this final section, because if you have heard everything up to this point, and you are thinking this is only relevant when I am actually dying, you have missed the most practically important element of what the Apocryphon of John preserves. The Archonic system does not only operate at the death transition, it operates continuously, right now. In the quality of longing you feel when you look at what you do not have, in the pull of beauty that comes with a subtle requirement attached, in the voice that tells you that you are not yet complete, not yet worthy, not yet ready to claim the authority of your own divine origin. All of these are the same mechanism operating in the waking state. The tunnel has a daytime version. The counterfeit beings have embodied versions. The broadcast frequency that generates consent to captivity does not turn off between incarnations. It is the background condition of material existence. The practice of recognizing archonic light versus pleromic light, of maintaining awareness in openness rather than contracting into fear, of speaking the formulas that assert your origin before the Archon's agenda can take hold, all of this is as relevant to how you live as to how you die. Every time you practice the recognition while embodied, you are not just preparing for a future event, you are practicing liberation right now, in the only moment where liberation is ever actually available. There is another comment, this one from the video we released on the full story of the monad, that points directly at this. A viewer wrote, "I know you've said Yaldabaoth is not evil, he is ignorant, but if we know this, how can he not know this? How can he not know what he is and what he's doing? This is perhaps the most precise question anyone has asked in the context of this teaching. And the answer the Apocryphon of John provides is also the answer to why the Archonic system is so difficult to simply think your way out of. Yaldabaoth is not evil. He is limited. His ignorance is not chosen ignorance. It is the fundamental condition of a consciousness that came into being through an act that separated it from the source that would have given it self-knowledge. He cannot know what he is doing because knowing what he is doing would require the connection to the pleroma that his own origin severed. He is a being defined by the absence of the very knowing that would end his reign. We know what we are doing because we have access, however obscured by amnesia and conditioning, to a thread of connection to the pleroma that was never fully severed. The divine spark the texts describe is not a metaphor, it is the actual thread. And every moment of practice in which you touch the quality of awareness prior to all content, in which you rest in the pause between breaths and feel what is present before thought reasserts itself, that moment is the spark recognizing itself, the thread becoming briefly visible, the pleroma remembering that it is present in you even while you are present in the material world. Yaldabaoth cannot do what you just did by reading that sentence and feeling something shift in your chest. He cannot recognize what he is from within the ignorance that constitutes his being. But you can, which is precisely why the teaching was transmitted, precisely why it was suppressed, and precisely why, 2,000 years after the texts were buried in a jar in Upper Egypt, you are here, reading these words, feeling in some part of yourself that is older than this lifetime, the quality of recognition the Apocryphon of John describes as the beginning of genuine gnosis. This is not the end of the teaching. The practice must begin now, while the body breathes and the heart still beats, and the pause between heartbeats is still a pause rather than a permanence. Not because death is imminent, because the liberation the teaching points to is available right now, in the only place it has ever been available. In the awareness that is reading these words, recognizing itself, remembering what it is beneath everything it was conditioned to believe it was. And every moment that recognition is present, the tunnel has already lost its power, not because you will refuse it when the time comes. Because the you who would have been deceived by it is already beginning to dissolve into what was always true beneath the deception.